Welcome to the introduction course of web development, where you'll learn the basics of HTML and CSS. Whether you're new to coding or trying to expand your skills on HTML and CSS, I'm thrilled to welcome you to the world of web development. This course is dedicated to guiding you through the process of building your own website from the ground up, using two of the most used languages in the field. So over the next 4 sections, we'll dive into the essential topics such as how web development works, the HTML and CSS fundamentals, creating your own website, and the tools most commonly used by web developers today. But before we embark on this adventure, let's see how this course is structured and how we are going to tackle it together. So we'll begin by the introduction section, providing an overview of web development as a whole, the necessary tools for building websites, and building your very first simple website to grasp the entire process. Next, we'll go into the fundamentals of HTML. So here you'll learn the definition, functionality, and the language's purpose on a website. By the end of this section, you'll know the basics to start structuring your website. Following that, we'll focus on CSS and understand how it complements HTML to enhance the visual appeal of websites. Finally, we have the project section, where we'll build your very own portfolio website together, and by the end, you'll have something to showcase your friends and family. Throughout this course, I encourage you to practice regularly and try to follow along the videos by replicating what you see. And don't hesitate to experiment and try new things. Remember, the best way to learn coding is by practice. I hope you're as excited as I am to get started, so let's dive in and start our web development journey together. Now, before we get into the actual course, I think it's a good idea for you to have an overhead view on how websites are made and how do they work. So let's talk about web development. And web development is the part on computer science that's responsible for everything web related. And it can typically be separated into 2 parts, the front end and the back end. And the way this typically works is every time you go onto your browser and you type in some kind of URL, then you are actually making a request on the internet to a specific server. So in this case, if you type in my website in your browser, what the browser is actually doing under the hood is sending a request with some data onto my server that is present on the internet. Then, depending on the website and the use cases, the server can do a set of operations in order to fulfill your request. But typically, it has some kind of a communication with a database. And of course, this can be made using multiple languages. So for example, for the server, it can be done with Node or Java. And the database, for example, can be used with MySQL or MongoDB or whatever technology you prefer. But the most use case is a server talking to a database and then retrieving some kind of data to fulfill your requests. So then finally, the server sends a response back to your browser with the necessary files for your browser to interpret and show you visually the website. And again, this is always dependent on the type of website, but typically what we have is a HTML, a CSS, and a JavaScript file. These 3 languages are the pillars for web development, and they are the most typical way that most browsers nowadays interpret code and then render onto your screen as a web page. But why do we have to have 3 separate languages? Well, because each one of them will have a specific function onto rendering your website. So starting with the first one, HTML, this is the language responsible for telling the browser what do you want to render onto your screen and where in the page do you want to render. So for example, as you can see here, first we have a header 1 with the value my website on the top of the page. Then we have a simple paragraph, and then we have a navigation container with a few links inside, and then an article with a header and a paragraph, each with their own set of values. So this is the tool responsible, again, to tell the browser what you want to render and where in the page do you want to render. But of course, this is not a pretty website, right? So in order to style it, we have the second language, CSS. And the way this works is CSS has a special syntax that tells the browser which will be the styles of each of the elements we see over here in our HTML. So for example, If we want to say we want to change the style of our header one and our paragraph, we can say so with CSS. And as you can see, this is a representation of the previous page. So it has the same elements. It has the first header, my website, the paragraph, the links, and the article with the header and the paragraph. But it's completely different from our previous example because we used CSS to style each of these elements in our own way. Finally, we have JavaScript, which will not be the scope of this course, but it is the language responsible for the logic of our website. So for example, every time the user clicks on a button or a link, what do we want to happen in our web page? And JavaScript is the language that has the logic you define to make the web page dynamic and function in regards to your own use case. So in order to build your first website, you will need a text editor and a browser. Now for this course, we are going to use a specific text editor and a specific browser, but I'm going to show you that it is possible to build your website without using these specific tools. So for example, if you're on Windows, you can create a new file, or if you are on a Mac, then we can go ahead and open the text edit, create a new document, and inside our new document, let's go ahead and create our first web page. And don't worry about what you're seeing right now. We are going to talk about this, and later in the course, you will be able to understand all of this code. But for now, let's simply go ahead and save this file, like so, and let's call it index. So every time we build a new file for our code, we have to call it index because it is the convention of the browsers to always open the first index.html file. So let's go ahead and save it on our desktop. Okay, perfect. So now the last thing we need to do in order for our browser to be able to interpret this file, what we need to do is go onto our Format tab and make this a plain text. So let's go ahead and click OK. And as you can see, we now have our plain text file. But the problem now is that it's on the txt format. So let's go ahead and get more information from our file. And let's change the extension from txt to HTML, like so. So yes, we want to use it. Perfect. So now we have our first HTML file for our web page. And in order to see this actually being rendered onto the screen, what we need to do is actually have a browser to be able to open this file and show us all of our web page from this document. So let's go ahead and on our file, open with. And for now, let's go with Safari. And as you can see, we now have our website from our text document. So we have our heading here saying my first heading, and we have the paragraph saying my first paragraph. Perfect. Now, of course, you could apply all of the teachings from this course using a plain text editor, but we developers like to actually make our lives easier when developing new web pages. So in order to do so, instead of using a plain text editor, what we are going to use for this course is a code editor. And the code editor that we are going to use is called VS Code, like so. Let's go ahead and go to the code.visualstudio.com. And from here, simply download VS Code to your environment. So in my case, I'm going to go with Mac. So let's go ahead and download this. And now let's go ahead and extract. And as you can see, we now have the Visual Studio Code program. So let's go ahead and open it. And this is the program that we are going to use to type all of our files for our projects. This comes already with a predefined set of tools that will make our lives as developers much easier than using a plain text editor. Now, again, for the browser, you can use which one you prefer, but I recommend you to use the one we are going to use for our course, which will be Google Chrome. So now if everything went okay, you will have something like this. So on the left, we have our code editor, Visual Studio Code, and on the right, we have our browser. So from now on, we can build our files here and then see them over here. Okay, so let's go ahead and build the first website, which will be the same as we did previously, but now using our set of tools. So the way Visual Studio Code works is by creating new projects. And a project on Visual Studio Code is simply a new folder. So let's go ahead and create a new folder, like so. And let's call it first website. So now what we can do on Visual Studio Code is at the top, click on File, and then click Open Folder. Let's go ahead and select our new folder, first website, open. And now, as you can see, we have on our Explorer the first website project. Perfect. So as I said before, the first thing we need in order to be able to build a website is a HTML file. And that HTML file needs to have the name index, so the browser can know that this is the first HTML file that it needs to render. So let's go ahead and right-click, create a new file, and let's call it index.html. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's close our Explorer by clicking on the icon. And let's go ahead and put our previously saved code. And again, don't worry, I will explain what all of this means. But for now, simply copy and paste this, save the file, and now simply go back onto our desktop and open our file with Google Chrome. So as you can see, we now have our first website loaded into Chrome. And we can actually go ahead and already do some changes. So for example, if we change the header here to say my second heading, we now just need to save the file. And to actually see the changes on our browser, we have to simply reload the page. As you can see, we now have the second on my second heading. Okay, perfect. So now we know how to build a first website, and we have our code editor and our browser. The next thing we need is to actually make our lives even easier. And to do that, we are going to install a set of VS Code extensions. So let's go ahead and open this. And we are going to click on the extensions icon right over here. This will open the extensions marketplace, which has multiple extensions already available to download and help us develop our product easier. And the first extension we are going to install, it's going to be a code highlighter, so we can actually have a little bit of a visual cue between our code. And that extension is called theme. So let's go ahead and search that. It's going to be the first one, and simply click on install. And once it's installed, you can go ahead and select a different theme, and I'm going to go with the theme darker, like so. Perfect. So if we go now onto our HTML file, we can see that we now have a different color scheme for all of our code. And this is useful because we can now distinguish one thing from another more easily. So for example, we can see that all of our tags are on a pinkish color, while the text itself is on a white color. So we now have a clear distinction of what is what. Now, another extension we are going to use is a formatter. And what does this mean? So let me show you. As you can see, we have our HTML page like so. If we reload it, it's exactly the same. But let's say that instead of having the code like this, we have it like so, right? And what you will see is that this is exactly the same thing. So if we go ahead and reload the page, you can see that nothing changes. But visually, our code did change. And this is actually very important because it is very important to have a readable code so we can easily interpret what the code is doing. So for example, if we had something like this, you can see that this is much harder to understand what it is. But if we go ahead and reload this, it's exactly the same thing for the browser. So it's nice to have our code formatted in a specific way. And in order to do so, we can go ahead and install the prettier extension. So let's go ahead and click this. And I already have installed, so I'm just going to enable it. Okay, perfect. So now what we can do is on our document, right-click and click Format Document. And as you can see, it automatically made our code a little bit prettier. So now we have what we call a indentation, and this simply means that we have a tab between each of the elements. So for example, we know that the body element is inside the HTML element, and that the header and paragraph are inside the body element. Now, one thing we already saw is that if we make a change, for example, on the paragraph over here, let's go ahead and type second. Once we save our code, we don't see the immediate changes on our browser. We have to reload the page in order to do so. But we want to see the changes every time we save our file immediately. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and install the Live Server plugin. So it's this one over here. And again, I already have this installed, so I'm just going to enable it. Perfect. And as you can see, we now have this button here at the bottom saying go live, click to run a live server. And we are going to talk about live servers in more detail. But for now, what we have to know is that this is the usual way we actually deploy our applications on the web. So we don't actually open our files and check the content of the files, but we actually set up a server that deploys all of the files for us. So let's go ahead and simply click on this button, and it's going to start a new server on port 5500. So as you can see, now in our browser, we have our live server with the localhost endpoint and the port for our application. Then we have / and the name of the file we want to open, which in this case is the index.html file. Again, don't worry about this, we will talk later in more detail. But from now on, when we want to develop, simply click on the Start Live, and let's go ahead and develop using a live server. So now, for example, if we go over here and change the heading for third, like so, once we save the document, you can see that the changes are already applied and we don't need to reload the page. Perfect. Okay, so let's start by first understanding how HTML works. So first of all, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And unlike other languages, HTML, it's not technically a programming language. It's actually a markup language. And this is the type of language that's used to describe the structure of our web page and all of the content inside. So it consists of a set of elements that describe different types of content that we want inside our website. And these elements can have inside another element, and so on and so forth. And we can have then a tree-like structure with the first element on the top, and then inside all of the other elements we want to add into our web page. The browser can then interpret this tree of elements and actually render a website visually to your users with this element structure. So let's start by figuring out what an element is. In a nutshell, this is a HTML element. So it consists of a opening tag, represented here by the lesser than sign followed by the name of the element, and then closing with the greater than sign. So in this case, we are creating a header1 element. Then every element has to have a closing tag, and it's very similar to the opening tag, with the minor difference that it has to have the / after the lesser than symbol. So as you can see, it's represented by lesser than symbol, / the name of the element, so in this case, h1 for header1, and then the greater than symbol. Now, in between the opening and the closing tag, we have the content of our element. And this content can be either a text or another element itself inside this element. So if we see a more complex example, we can see that now we have 3 elements, a div element, a header1 element, and a paragraph element. Each of these elements will have their opening tags, again represented by the lesser than symbol, followed by the name of the element, and then the greater than symbol. And all of them have their closing tags. Of course, that inside our header1, for example, we have a text. Inside our paragraph element, we also have a text. But inside our div element, we actually have 2 elements, the header1 and the paragraph element. And a website is nothing more than a set of all of these elements wrapped inside one another. Okay, so let's start by understanding the structure of a HTML document. So from our previous example, let's go ahead and select everything and delete it, like so. So we now have a empty HTML file, and let's go ahead and understand each of the elements. So the first element that we need is actually the doc type, and this element serves the purpose of letting the browser know that this file is indeed a HTML file. So let's go ahead and create our tag with the lesser than symbol, like so, and exclamation mark, and then DOCTYPE, like so. So this is the first element that every HTML file needs to have, and we have to tell the browser that this document is of type HTML. So let's go ahead and space, type in HTML. Then let's go ahead and close with the greater than symbol, Okay, perfect. So now that we let the browser know that this is in fact a HTML file, let's go ahead and create our main HTML tag. And again, this is mandatory for all HTML files. And as you can see, as I type in, VS Code automatically created the closing tags. But for now, let's go ahead and delete this so we can actually do this manually. So this is the opening tag for our HTML page. And now let's go ahead and at the bottom, create the closing tag. So the lesser than symbol, and then to close it, / HTML, and then greater than symbol, like so. So now we have our HTML opening tag and the closing tag for our HTML. So everything else is going to go inside of these two tags. And again, for all of our HTML files, we will need two new tags. And the first one, it's going to be the head tag. So head, like so. And the second one, it's going to be the body, like so. And what are these tags? So the first one, the head element, it's going to have all of the information about the page that will not be visible to the user. So for example, the page title, any kind of file sourcing, and etc. So all of the data that the website needs to know but doesn't want to present to the user, it's going to go inside the head element. So let's start with the first one, and it's going to be the page title. So let's go ahead and create a title tag, like so. Don't forget to open and close it. And inside, we are going to set the title for our web page. So in this case, let's go ahead and type in my first web page, like so. Go ahead and save it. And as you can see at the top on the browser, we have the title of our web page. Perfect. Now the body tag, it's going to contain all of the elements that we want to render to the user. So the headers, the paragraphs, images, videos, whatever, everything, it's going to go inside our body. So let's go ahead and start with a simple header. So H1, like so. Open and close it. And let's call this my first header, like so. So go ahead and save this. And as you can see, we now have rendered our first header on the page. So again, everything inside of our head element, it's going to have all of the metadata that the website needs to have, but doesn't want to show the user. And then inside our body, we are going to render all of the elements that we want to show to the user. Now, again, what we can do is right-click on our file and then click on Format Document so we have a clean code, like so. And if you want to always have your code formatted without having to right-click and click on Format Code, what we can do is actually go here on the top, click on the Code, Preferences, and then Settings. It's going to open our settings page, and inside, let's go ahead and what we can type in is format, and this will pop up a few options. And what we want to do is click on the format on save. So every time the file gets saved, it will automatically format the code. So go ahead and click on this, like so, close the settings. And now if we try to make this a little bit ugly, like so, let's say this is right over here. If we now save our file, you can see that it automatically formatted the code for us. Perfect. So let's start by understanding the most simple elements, which are the text elements. So for the text elements, we have a few options. We've already seen the header, but let's start with the simplest one of all, which is the paragraph. So it's going to be a P element, like so. And don't forget, we always have the opening and the closing tag, and inside we are going to put the content. So for the paragraph, let's go ahead and say, this is a very simple paragraph. Go ahead and save this. And as you can see, this is the most simplest type of text element, which is a paragraph. Now, we also have headers, as we've seen. We have the header 1, like so. And let's say this is a header. Perfect. And as you can see, the header not only is a different element, but also has a different styles of the paragraph. So this one is bolder, bigger, and it tells the user that it has, in fact, a different meaning code-wise. So we know that this P element, it's going to be a different element than this h1 element. Now, we don't only have the h1, we actually have the h2. So let's go ahead and do this. And as you can see, the header 2, it's going to be also a header, but with a different styling than the header 1. And this is actually going to be true until the 6th one. So let's go ahead and give it the header 3, 4, 5, and 6. Don't forget the closing tags, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So as you can see, HTML has 6 different kinds of headers, and all of them follow this order from the biggest to the smallest header possible. So another important element is the bold element. And in order to show you, let's go ahead and copy this paragraph and let's paste it here at the bottom. Now, the bold paragraph is simply to wrap something inside of a text element and change the styling of that element. So for example, if we want to set the very word into bold, the way we would do is inside our paragraph element, create a new bold element, which is B. Don't forget, it has the opening and the closing tag. And then inside, we put the text we want to make it bold, like so. So as you can see, we now have our paragraph and the very word is in the bold style. Another way we can style our text is by using the italic element, and it's going to be the I one, like so. And like the bold, we are going to wrap the text with this italic element. So as you can see, now the word paragraph is in italic. Okay, perfect. So now we have all of our header types, and we have a paragraph with a few of the stylings like the bold one and the italic one. Now, another important thing to know is how to comment your code. And what this means is, let's say that we have a piece of code, like for example, this paragraph over here, and we don't want to actually show the user, but we don't also want to delete it for whatever reason we as developer need. So what we can do is actually comment out this code, and a comment is made by the following way. So it's going to be the lesser sign, exclamation, minus, minus. And as you can see, VS Code already auto-completed. But what you need to know is that this is the opening tag for our comment, and this is the closing tag for our comment. And everything that goes inside, it's going to be left out by the browser. So for example, if we now take this and put the closing tag below our paragraph, then we know that everything that's inside these tags, it's going to be comment out. So let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, we still have our paragraph in our code, but it's no longer in the browser. This is very useful when we want to actually test a few things, or we want to leave some kind of comment to other developers so they know why we did the way we did. So for example, we could type in this paragraph need more styling, for example. So as you can see, this is all a comment. So now either you or another developer knows why this is commented out, and we have useful information for development purposes. To bring up back our paragraph, let's go ahead and delete our closing tag for the comments and delete the opening tag and the text like so. Perfect. The next set of very important elements are the list. And a list can be either an ordered list or an unordered list. And let's go ahead and start with the ordered list. So to do so, the first thing we want to do is create a new tag, and it's going to be the OL tag, like so. And OL stands for ordered lists. And inside our ordered list element, we want to input a line item. So again, a new tag, LI for line item. And then inside, we can actually type whatever we want. So for example, item 1. Let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, we now have the item 1 with the ordered tag. So in this case, it's the first item, so it's going to have the number 1. If we add a new item, so LI again, and let's call this item X, for example, as we can see, we now have the second item, which will be item X. And you can go ahead and add as much as you prefer. So for example, let's type this banana. This one is going to be called home, like so. And you can add as many as you want, and it's going to always be ordered depending on the position of the item inside the list. Now, if you want to make a list but you don't want it to be ordered, then we can create a unordered list. So new tag, UL for unordered list. Don't forget to add the opening and the closing tag. And like the ordered list, we are going to create a line item. So let's go ahead and type in item 1. And let's already add another one saying home. So as you can see, we now have another list, but this time it's not going to be numbered. So don't forget, every time we want to create a new list and we want it to be numbered, then we are going to create a ordered list like so. And then inside we are going to create a line item element for each of the items we want on that list. If we don't want it to be numbered, then simply do the same, but for a unordered list. Now, before we go ahead and talk about more elements, we have to talk about a new concept, which is called an attribute. And an attribute is nothing more than a piece of data to describe the elements. So, for example, let's start with our HTML tag. So, we know that this document is of type HTML, but we want to tell the browser that this HTML document is also going to be on the English language. And one way to do that is to actually add an attribute to our HTML tag. And to do that, inside our tag, so before the greater than symbol, we are going to give it a space from the HTML tag name. And then we are going to type lang for language, equal sign, and then double quotes. So this lang over here is what it's called a attribute. And in this case, it's going to be the language that we want for our document. So the way we do it is do a equal sign to assign the value from the right onto our attribute on the left. So in this case, since we want to have this document in the English language, we can go ahead and type in EN for English, like so. So now the browser knows that not only this is a HTML tag, but it's going to also have a attribute of language with the value EN for English. And since we are here talking about attributes, we can already go ahead and also add more information onto our page. And inside our head element, let's go ahead and create a new element, and it's going to be called meta, standing for metadata. And the metadata tag, it's not going to have any kind of content inside. So remember, whenever we are dealing with a no content element, then we don't need the opening and the closing tag. We can always close inside the opening tag like so. And the meta tag can have a few attributes, and one that we are going to use is actually the type of characters that our document is going to have. So, for example, if we were dealing with a website from Japan or China, we know that they have a different kind of characters than the English language does. So it's good to tell the browser which type of characters that our page is going to have. And in our case, for the English language, it's going to be the UTF-8. So let's go ahead and assign our new attribute, which is going to be called charset. And remember, to assign a value, it's always going to be the equal sign and then the double quotes with the value inside the double quotes. And as I said before, for the English language, the type of characters that the document is going to have, it's going to be the UTF-8, like so. So as you can see, this didn't change anything visually for the user, but this did change the way that the browser interprets our page. And this is very useful for search engine optimization. So for example, Google, whenever it checks a website, it's going to analyze the HTML code for that website. And the more information it has, then the better the optimization for that search engine. So the users can more easily find the content they are looking for. And if we give this type of metadata, for example, the character set, then it will increase the search engine optimization score for our website. So it's always good to have as much as information possible regarding our web page. Let's go ahead and check another very important element, which is the image element. And in order to do so, what we can do is go ahead and download an image. So let's open a new tab and let's search for an image. So for example, the egg over here. We can go ahead and right click and save image as. Now let's go ahead and save it on our first website folder, like so. Go ahead and save this. And if we open our Explorer tab on VS Code, we can see that we now have the image saved in our folder. Now let's go ahead and change this. First of all, let's call this image, like so. And it doesn't have to be image, it can be whatever name you prefer. I'm just going to go with image to make everything simple. And it's not going to be of type WebP, it's actually going to be of type JPEG. And bear in mind that this can be either JPEG, PNG, or any other image type that exists. I'm just going to go with this one for now, so let's go ahead and save this. And now to render this image onto the screen, what we can do is, let's go ahead and first of all, close this. And at the bottom, let's create a new tag. And it's going to be the image tag, like so. And like the meta tag we did at the top, it's not going to have any kind of content inside. So we can already close this on the opening tag, like so. And the way we fetch the actual image is by referencing the source attribute. So now we know what a attribute is. Let's go ahead and type in source, like so. Don't forget equal sign and double quotes. And then inside, we are going to reference the path for our image. So in this case, it's going to be, as you can see, image.jpg. So let's go ahead and do this. Image JPEG, like so. So if we save it, we can see that now we have our image of the eggs on our browser. Now, of course, this is too big. So what we can do is actually add another attribute, and bear in mind that each element can have multiple attributes. It doesn't need to have just one. And one of the attributes that we want to use for the image is the width attribute, like so. And don't worry about these values. I will explain this later, but for now, let's just give it a value, for example, of 100. So as you can see, the image is much smaller now, and this is because the 100 represents 100 pixels of your screen. And again, don't worry for now about that. We will talk about this later, but bear in mind that this is going to be on pixels. So if we want a little bit wider, let's go ahead and add 300. And as you can see, the image grew. Now, one thing you might notice is that while changing the width, it's also changing the height of the image, but keeping the aspect ratio of the image the same. But if we want, we can actually change the height of the image. And if we give it, for example, the same value as the width, then it's going to have a different aspect ratio, and it's going to deform the image to set the same width with the same height. So this is up to you if you want to do this or not. But bear in mind that depending on the image size, it can distort the image. If you don't want to distort the image, then either change only the height or the width, and then the aspect ratio of the image will be preserved. Now, one good practice for the images is to always have an alternative text. And this can be for multiple reasons. One, for example, is that if for some reason we fetch the wrong path for the image, so for example, if I put a E here, we know that this file doesn't exist. And if we go ahead and save this, then you can see that it renders a broken image icon. So what we can do is to actually add a new attribute called all, like so, and then just give a little description for what would be the image if it was rendered. So for example, in this case, it's going to be an image of some eggs, like so. So now, as you can see, when we don't have the image, it's going to render the alternative text of the image. If we go ahead and add the correct path, it's not going to display the text, but rather the image. And this is useful not only for when we have the wrong path, but also for search engine optimization. So we can give a little bit of context when we have a search engine analyzing our HTML on what this image represents. So in this case, it's going to be the image of some eggs. And with this information, the engine can extrapolate what this image is about and increase the score of the search engine optimization. So it's always a good practice to have an alternative text in all of your images. Now, another very important element is the video element. And the video element is going to be very similar to the image element. So let's go ahead and create one at the bottom, create a video tag. And unlike the image element, the video is going to have some content inside. So it's going to need the opening and the closing tag, like so. Now you can go ahead and download any kind of video and then do the same as you did for the image. So if we go on to our Explorer, simply save a new video. In this case, I'm going to go with this one inside the project folder. Now to reference our video, unlike the image source attribute, we are actually going to add a new element inside the video element, and it's going to be called source. Now, the source element doesn't have any kind of content, so let's go ahead and close it already. And it's going to have an attribute with the source for the path of our video, much as we have here on our image, like so. So let's go ahead and reference the path for our video, which it's going to be video.mp4. Now, unlike the image tag, we are going to specify the type of video that we want to render onto our video element. So let's go ahead and add a new attribute, and it's going to be called the type attribute. And for this video, it's going to be a video/mp4 type, like so. Now, why do we do this instead of referring the source inside the video itself? Well, because we might have the video on a different format than MP4. And what we can do is actually add a new source. So let's go ahead and copy this and let's paste it on the top, like so. And let's say we have a video not on MP4 type, but on, for example, OGG type, like so. Then this is going to be also the type OGG. And what HTML is going to do is it's going to check the source for our video and the correct type. So for example, if we do have our video on the OGG type, then it's going to select this source first. Otherwise, it's going to go on to the next source and check if we have the video with the correct type. So in this case, it's going to be MP4. If we do have this video type, then it's going to render this source over here instead of rendering the first source. And don't forget that it's going to check this sequentially. So the first type, it's going to check it's the first tag you put here. So if we had this with this order, then it would first check the MP4 file. And in our case, it would find the video of type MP4. And this source is not going to be checked. So bear in mind the order of the video source. Okay, perfect. And as you can see, we have our video over here. It's a little bit big, so let's go ahead and fix that. The same way we did with the image. So inside our video tag, let's go ahead and add a new attribute, and it's going to be the width, and let's give it a width of 500. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we now have our video over here, but it's not doing anything. And this is because every time you render a video, it's going to actually be paused until the user clicks on the play. But what we can do is actually add a new attribute called autoplay, like so. And every time the video gets rendered on the screen, then it's going to autoplay the video. If we want to, we can actually give some more controls to the user by giving the attribute controls, like so. So now, as you can see, if we hover with our mouse inside the video element, we have the play button, the pause button, the full screen, the sound button, and then a few more options. Now, one of the most important elements that exists are the hyperlinks. And these elements are the ones responsible for a user to be redirected from one page to another on the internet. And in order to do that, we are going to use the anchor element. So right here at the top of our image, let's go ahead and create a new anchor. And it's going to be the A tag, like so. And then inside our anchor element, we can actually define the text we want to present the user for our hyperlink. So for example, if we type in awesome website, like so, and before we do that, let's go ahead and instead of putting this on top of the image, we are going to put this on top of our ordered list, just so we can see it better. So as you can see, we now have the awesome website web link, but for now, it's not doing anything. And that's because we actually have to give the reference to where we want the user to be redirected to. And the way we do that is by typing in the href attribute inside the anchor element. Now, inside the reference, simply type in the URL for the page you want to redirect the user. So in our case, I'm going to go with my website. So don't forget to add the protocol. This is strictly necessary if we want to reference a page outside of our page, and then the URL for the website. So let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, we now have a different styling representing a clickable link. If we go ahead and click this, then you can see that the user gets redirected to the page for our URL. We can go ahead and click on the back button to go back into our page. And if we want to redirect the user to the same website, but instead of rendering the new website on the same page, we want to render on a new tab, then what we can do is inside the anchor element, add a new attribute, and it's going to be called target, like so. And in order to open on a new tab, it's going to be necessary to be of type _blank. This is the way we tell the anchor element to open this website on a new tab. So let's go ahead and save this. And now if we click on the same link as before, we can see that it opens on a new tag and our web page is still open on the previous tag. Perfect. Now, this can be used not only for an external website, but it can also be used for our own website. So, for example, we now are on the index.html file, but we can go ahead and create a new one for a new page. So let's open our Explorer and let's create a new file and call it page.html. Now, let's go ahead and copy the basic structure from the index. So it's going to be the doc type HTML. It's going to have the HTML tag. So let's go ahead and already close this like so. Inside, it's going to have the head element. We can change the title to say, for example, my second page, like so, and then add a body tag with the header saying, this is the second page. So now what we can do is back in our index.html file, let's go ahead and create a new anchor, like so. We don't want to open on a new tab, so let's go ahead and delete this. And let's render something like go to page 2. Now, instead of having the HTTPS protocol, what we can do is actually remove this to tell that we want to open a new file on our current URL. So in our case, it's going to be the 127.0.0.1 with the 5500 port. But instead of being on the following file, it's actually going to be on the page.html we've just created, like so. So now, as you can see, we have a new hyperlink. If we click on it, then we are going to go onto the page.html with the HTML for our second page. And another thing we could do is actually go ahead and copy the hyperlink, go on to the page.html, and below our header, let's go ahead and paste the hyperlink and let's say go back, for example. And now instead of referencing the page.html, let's go ahead and reference the index.html. So now, as you can see, we have a new hyperlink on the second page that redirects the user to the main page of our web page. Okay, so now that we know some of the most basic elements, it's time to talk about structure. So as of now, you can see that our web page is a little bit unorganized. So we have a paragraph here, some headers, some hyperlinks, a list, image, and video, but there is no structure to our web page. And one way to structure a web page is by using containers. Containers are simply more HTML elements, but they have the property of not being visible to the user. And they are typically used not to actually show a difference to the user, but to give the elements some kind of semantic meaning. And the first and most basic container that exists is the div element. So let's go ahead and create a new div element, like so. And let's go ahead and inside our div, let's put all of our headers. So go ahead and copy, paste this. And then if you save the code, you can see that there is no visible change when wrapping all of these headers inside our div container. The only thing that changes is the meaning behind all of these headers. So we are now saying that these headers belong to a group, which is wrapped by this div container. And this is very useful not only to have a different semantic meaning, but also in the future when we start styling with CSS to have a more robust selection on which elements we want to style. So the div container is a general purpose container, but then we have some use case specific containers. For example, the navigation element. So let's go ahead and create one, and it's called nav, like so. And this container is typically the one responsible to have all of the hyperlinks for the navigation of the user. So for example, we have this hyperlinks over here, and what we can do is actually copy this and simply paste it inside our navigation wrapper, like so. So again, visually nothing changed, but now not only the search engines know that these hyperlinks are inside a navigation container, so they have a different semantic meaning behind, but we can then later style these elements in a more intuitive way. So for example, instead of styling each individual hyperlink, we could simply style the whole navigation container, and it would make our lives much easier. Another useful container is the header container. So let's go ahead and create a header element like so. And this is typically the container that you want to put on the top part of your page. So for example, some kind of a header saying this is my page, for example. And again, once more, visually, this changes nothing, but this gives us the possibility for a better search engine optimization and for a better styling of the elements. Another very useful container is the article container. And this is typically to, as the name says, to wrap an article inside. So some kind of content, namely text that we want to render onto the user, then it's going to go inside our article element. So let's go ahead and actually copy this 2 paragraphs inside our article container, like so. Now, bear in mind that we can actually interconnect all of these elements. So, for example, our navigation container, we can actually put inside, for example, of our header container. And it makes sense because every time we go onto a website, you typically have the navigation on the top of the page. So it makes sense to put this container inside the header container. The last container we are going to check is the footer container, and the footer typically goes on to the bottom of the page. So let's go ahead and on the bottom of the video, let's create a new footer element like so. And inside, let's simply give it a paragraph saying this is the footer of the page. So if we scroll down, we can see now that we have the footer for our page. Perfect. Now, before we move on to styling our elements, I want to talk a little bit more about semantic HTML. So as we've seen, we have these containers which don't actually change visually what it's presented to the user, but they offer a kind of meaning behind all of these elements. And this is very good for search engine optimization. So when a search engine is analyzing the HTML, then it can more quickly and efficiently track some kind of data. So for example, if the search engine wants to check which are the navigation links, then it just needs to search for the navigation container and then fetch each of the links inside this container. So for the end user, it doesn't make any difference, but for a program like a search engine, it makes the whole difference when searching for specific content. Not only that, but again, if we want to, as a developer, style each of these elements, then we can reference by this semantic element. And another type of semantic elements that exists are in the text. So for example, if we scroll down here to our paragraphs, we can see that we have the very word with the bold element and then the paragraph with the italic element. What we can also do is instead of adding the bold, we can add the strong element, like so. So if we now copy this inside the element, so we can see that visually it did change and it's identical to the bold element. The only difference between the two is on the meaning we are going to associate with that element. So for example, we know that this very word is a strong reference to something like, for example, again, the search engine optimization. So now we give the possibility for the engine to know which words in our document are very important. And in this case, it could be all of the words that are wrapped inside the strong element. And we can do the same for the italic by wrapping our words inside the EM element. And EM stands for emphasize. So this is all of the words that we want to emphasize, and again, change the styling accordingly. So it's going to have the same style as the italic one, but the meaning behind each of these words, it's going to be different. And programmatically, when searching for components, then they are going to have different meaning. I hope that you understand this, but if you don't, then don't worry. We are going to approach in a greater detail later when we start styling all of our elements. So now that you know the basics of HTML, it's time to move on to CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, like we see here, and it was a language created to represent and describe the visual style and the presentation of all of the content written in HTML. So, like I said before, while the purpose of HTML is to describe what type of content is going on to the web page, now CSS is going to represent the visual style of that content. It consists of a set of properties that are going to format the content's styles, like, for example, the color, font size, spacing, height, width, etc. So once we have our HTML, the browser is then going to interpret this CSS stylings, and it's going to apply to each of the HTML elements, changing visually what the user is going to, at the end, see from your website. And the way we define these properties in CSS is like so. So first of all, we have the selector, and this represents the element we want to change the style. So in this case, we want to change all of our paragraph elements, represented here by the P. We then have the declaration block, and this is represented by the brackets we can see over here and over here. So we have the opening bracket and we have the closing bracket, and all of the properties inside are going to be the declaration block. So next we have the properties, and the way we define them is by using a specific name for the specific property we want to change. So in this case, we want to change, for example, the font weight, and followed by the property, we have the column, and then we have the actual value we want to change for that property. So again, in this case, what we are telling is that we want to change the font weight, which is the property, to have a bold value for all of our paragraph elements. Not only that, but we also want to change the color property to the red value, again, for all of our paragraph elements. Okay, so let's go ahead and start styling our first website. And in order to do that, first thing we are going to do is actually duplicate it. So let's go ahead and do so. And let's change the name for second website, like so. So now let's go ahead and open a new window on Visual Studio Code. And at the top, let's go ahead and click on File and Open Folder. From the desktop, let's go ahead and open our second website, like so. So as of now, the project is still the same as we did with the HTML section, but we are now going to change it a little bit and start styling all of our elements. Let's go ahead and also open a new Chrome window, like so, and let's just put it full width, and also the VS Code, like so, and let's just put it side by side, so we can see the code and the actual result. Okay, perfect. Now, don't forget to start your server. Let's go ahead and click on the Go Live button. And this will open a new tab with the host URL and the port of your website. Perfect. So before we begin to learn all of the different kinds of CSS, we first need to know the different ways on how to use it on your website. And there are mainly three ways: inline, internal, and external. So let's go ahead and open our index.html, like so. Let's go ahead and close our Explorer, and let's take as an example the first header right here. So the first type of CSS, inline, we can do so by adding a new attribute to our element called the style, like so. So the style attribute will let us do some inline CSS, and then we can simply add all of the CSS properties that we want for this element inside our style attribute. So let's say, for example, that we want to change the color of this header to red. So in order to do that, one would first type in the property, so in this case, color, followed by a column, and then the value for the property. So in this case, red, like so. So as you can see, now our header has a different styling, which is the color that it is red. Now, one thing you have to bear in mind with this type of CSS is that it is not typically used, and whenever you can, avoid doing so, because this is considered a bad practice for a few reasons. One of them is that it can get a little bit confusing by styling each of the elements of a web page, and if we're dealing with a simple web page like this, then maybe that's not a problem, but if we are dealing with a large project, then it can get quite confusing and it can lead to a few bugs which are hard then to debug. So if you could avoid using inline CSS, I highly recommend so. Okay, perfect. So now let's check the other type of CSS, which is a internal CSS. And in order to do so, what we can do is on the top, on the head element of our web page, let's go ahead and create a new one and call it style, like so. So don't forget that everything that's inside our head element is not going to be visible to the user. So every time we want to define a new style on CSS, we can actually do so by creating a style tag on the head element. So the user won't be able to see the CSS code, but the changes will be applied onto all of the elements inside the body. So now let's say that we want to change the color of the second header right over here for a green color. So in order to do that, first of all, we are going to define the selector, and in this case, it's going to be the H2, followed by a brackets, like so. And inside the brackets, let's go ahead and define our color property to be of value green, like so. Perfect. So now, as you can see, we have the header 2 with the green color. Now, one good thing about the internal CSS is that unlike the inline one, if we have multiple elements of the same selector, then the changes will be applied to all of these elements. So for example, right over here, we said that the style of this H1 element is going to be red. But as you can see, we have another H1 over here that didn't have that effect. While defining on the internal CSS, we are saying that we want all of the H2 to be color green. So as an example, if we change this header from a H1 to a H2, like so, you can see that the green color property is going to be applied not only to this H2, but also to the top one. And this is because we are defining right over here that all of our H2 elements are going to have the following value for the following property. Now, the final type of CSS, the external ones, are the most commonly used and will be the ones we are going to use throughout this course. And in order to do so, what we need to do is, first of all, let's go ahead and open our Explorer and let's create a new file. You can name this file whatever you want, but typically we go with styles.css. So this is a CSS file. It will contain all of our CSS properties for our page, and we can already create one, for example, for the H3, like so, open brackets, and let's change the color to purple, like so. So as of now, we don't see the changes, and this is because we have now to reference this styles.css file onto our index.html file. So let's go back onto our HTML file. Let's close the Explorer. And in order to reference our CSS file, what we need to do is, again, inside our head element, let's go ahead and create a new element, which is called link. Now, the link element, it's not going to have any kind of content, so let's go ahead and already close it. And please do not mistake this link element with a hyperlink. So a hyperlink, as we've seen earlier, is a completely different element that takes the user from a page to another web page. While this link element simply is going to link a file through some kind of relationship. So in our example, let's go ahead and add the href attribute, and let's reference our styles.css file. The only thing we're missing is to define what kind of relationship we want with this file. And in order to do that, let's go ahead and add the rel attribute, like so. And the type of relationship we want is going to be of type style sheet, like so. Perfect. And as you can see, we now have our h3 with the purple colors. So we know for sure that this styles.css is being injected correctly onto our HTML file. Perfect. Now, the first properties we are going to see is everything related to styling text. And let's go ahead and create a new paragraph in order to do so. So P, and just say something like test me, like so. And of course, we are going to change all of the paragraphs, but let's go ahead and add this one. Now, back into our styles, let's go ahead and add a new selector, this time for the paragraph elements, like so. Open brackets, and let's start with one we already know, which is the color. So the color, as we've seen, it changes the color of the text to a specific color of our choice. So let's go and start with the blue one, like so. So as you can see, it changes the color of the paragraph. Now, another property we can add on to our text is the text transform. And this will allow us to actually capitalize, lowercase, or uppercase all of the text inside this element. So for example, if we choose the capitalize, like so, you can see that it capitalizes all of the letters inside our sentence. If we change it to lowercase, then all of the text is going to be lowercase. And finally, if we want the uppercase, to have all of the text with the uppercase, like so. The next one, it's going to be the font size, and you can change this property with a few types of units, but for now we are going to go with pixels. And don't worry, we will talk in more detail what this is, but for now think of the pixels as literally the size of a pixel of your screen. So for example, let's say that we want to change our text to 12 pixels, and the pixels is represented by px, like so. So in this case, we are going to say that we want all of our paragraph elements to have a 12 pixels font size. So let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, it did change the size of our text. So if we put something higher, like for example, 24, then you can see that it changes to a larger paragraph, almost the size of our header. Now, the next one, it's going to be the font family. And this simply represents the type of font that we want to use for our element. So as of now, by default, the font family of our paragraph is actually the serif type. So let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, nothing changed. This is because this is the default value of all of our paragraph elements. But we can change to whatever we want. For example, we have the sans serif right over here. So let's go ahead and type this. And as you can see, we now have a different font style for our paragraphs. And you can have and add to your elements a vast list of font family types. But for now, let's go with this one, and then later I'll explain a little bit more. Now, the next property we are going to see is the font style, like so. And this is pretty much the same as we did with our elements. So with this property, we can actually put all of our paragraph as a italic, like so. So as you can see, everything is italic now. So we don't need a specific tag to put the text italic, but we can change the style of our elements to actually have a italic font style. And now you can do the same with the bold property. And to do that, it's going to be with the font weight, like so. And this will change the thickness of the text. So we have multiple values. You can actually define, for example, 100. And this is going to be a very thin text. And we can increment, for example, 400, like so. You can see that the thickness gets higher. And we can go as high as, for example, bolder. So this is the highest thickness that a text allows. Or we can leave as a bold like we have with our bold elements. Finally, let's go ahead and see the line height, like so. And the line height represents the space between the lines of our text. and it's represented by the multiplied value of the font size. So if you leave it by 1, then the line height is going to be the same size as it is the font size. But if we put, for example, 1.2, then the height is going to be 1.2 times the 24 pixels we have on our font size. So let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, we now have more space between our text because we've effectively incremented the height of the lines. Now, of course, there are a lot more of properties for the text, but I think that these ones are the basic ones and they serve the purpose of actually changing a lot of what we are going to change in the future. So for now, let's go with these ones. But if you want to check more, you can always Google CSS properties. And there are a lot of websites with already a compact list of all of the CSS properties that you need. But for now, let's go with these ones. Okay, so now we know how to actually apply some of the CSS properties to a specific element. But let's say that we don't want to apply this only to all of our paragraphs, but we actually want to apply this also to another element. Let's say, for example, the header 4. So we want all of our paragraphs right over here and all of our h4 to have the same properties as the paragraph. Now, one way we could do this is to simply copy this and paste it right over here. So, of course, this would work, but it's a little bit inefficient. First of all, because we have repeated code. And second, because in the future, if we want to change something, for example, if we wanted to change the font size, change it to 12, for example, then we will have to apply also onto the paragraph, like so. And this can lead to a lot of confusion and bugs in your application when it starts to get bigger. So one way to do this is, first of all, let's go ahead and delete this. We don't need this. Let's change this back to 24. And what we want to say is we want to apply all of these styles not only to the paragraphs, but also to the h4 headers. And we can do that by using the comma. So every time we use the comma followed by a new selector, then we are telling CSS to apply all of these properties to the paragraph and to the h4. So let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, now our header 4, it's going to have the same stylings as our paragraphs. And we can add as many as we want. So for example, if we want also the h5 and the h6, then let's go ahead and do so. And as you can see, now all of our elements are going to have the same styling. Now let's go ahead and simply delete these ones for now, like so, perfect. And now let's do the opposite. So as of now, we are saying that we want to apply the same stylings to multiple elements. But what if we want to apply it to a specific element? So for example, we are saying that we want to change the styling of all of our paragraphs. But what if we wanted to change simply 1 or 2 paragraphs and not all of them? Then one way we can do this is by doing the following. So let's go back onto our HTML page. And let's go ahead and first of all, let's get rid of all of our stylings we did earlier. So delete the inline style and delete the internal one, like so. So we know we are dealing only with the external CSS. Okay, perfect. And back here on our paragraphs, let's say that we had another one. So go ahead and copy this and let's put it inside a new container, a div one, and let's put it right here. So let's change this to I'm a paragraph inside a div. Okay, so as you can see, as of now, all of our paragraphs have the same styling. But now we only want to change this and not change the other ones. So what we can do back in our CSS file, we know that this paragraph right over here is inside a div. So what we can do is combine all of these selectors. And the way we do so is the same way as we did with these two, by separating them with a comma. Now we are going to do the same, but without a comma. So if we want to select the paragraph inside the div, first of all, let's reference the div, like so, and then the paragraph, and that's it. So as of now, all of the properties inside here are going to be affected to all of the paragraphs that are inside a div. So let's, for example, change this to color red, like so. And as you can see, it still maintained all of the previous properties, which are these ones, But because we are now changing the color to red to all of the paragraphs inside the div, then this is going to affect only this one because it is the only one with the following combination of selectors. Perfect. Let's do another example. So let's change all of the list items. So let's go ahead and LI like so, and let's give it a color green, and the font size, it's going to be 24 pixels, like so. But now we only want the 24 pixels to be all of the list items inside a ordered list and not the ones inside a unordered list. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and specify all of our list items inside a unordered list. So UL for unordered list, and then list item. Go ahead and open the brackets, and now let's change the font size to 12, for example. Perfect. So as you can see, now all of the list items inside our unordered list will have a different CSS property than the ones for all the cases. Perfect. Okay, so now we have a more fine-grained control on which elements we want to change the styling, but it's still not enough. So for example, we've said over here that we want to change all of the list items inside an unordered list. But what if we want to change just one specific list item, for example, the home one? Then how would we do that? Or let's say that we want to change all of the list items that have the home value and not the other ones. So how could you do this? There are two ways to approach this. One is with classes and the other with IDs. And in order to check this, let's go ahead and first of all, let's delete all of our CSS like so. And let's say we want to change the styling of these two paragraphs, but not this one. And let's say for now, for simplicity, we only want to change the color to red. So one way we could do so is we know that these three paragraphs are inside a article element. So we could, for example, say article followed by paragraph and change the color to red, right? Well, no, because all of the three paragraphs are going to be inside of this article element. And we only want to change these two, not the first one. So one way to do this is by using classes. So let's go ahead and do so on our HTML page. And for the second and third paragraph, let's add a new attribute called the class. And inside the class, we are going to define a specific name of our choice. So for example, let's go ahead and call this change underscore this. For example, now let's go ahead and copy this attribute and simply put it on the third paragraph. So now the second and the third paragraph are going to have the same class. So now back in our CSS file, what we can do is to specify the CSS properties to all of the elements that have a specific class. And to reference a class, what we first need to do is start with a dot and then the name of the class. So in our case, our class is going to be called change underscore this. But don't forget that if we don't have a dot, then we are trying to reference a element. But this is not a element, it's a class. And in order to reference a class, it's going to always start with a dot, like so. So now if we save this, we can see that only the two paragraphs with the change this class are going to effectively be changed. Okay, perfect. And let's go ahead and check another example. So earlier we said that we wanted to change only the list items with the home value. So let's go ahead and create a new class and let's call it home for now. And now simply copy this and paste it on our list item. So again, going on to our styles, dot to reference a class, and then the name of the class. Now simply change this to whatever property you prefer. I'm going to change the color to green. And as you can see, now the list items with the home class are going to have a green color. Okay, perfect. But now what if you want to change a specific element? So not a set of them, but only a specific one. Well, we could actually add a new class to only that element, but that's a little bit counterproductive. So what we can do is actually use IDs. So let's say that we want to change the test me paragraph right over here. what we can do is inside our paragraph element, let's add a new attribute called ID. And let's call this unique paragraph, like so. Okay, so now we have a identification for this paragraph. And if we go back onto our styles, we can do the same referencing as we did with the classes, but with the IDs. And the way we do so is instead of being a dot, so the dot, it's always going to be for a class, it's going to be with a hash. So whenever we start a reference with a hash, then we are going to reference the ID of an element. And in this case, it's going to be the name unique paragraph, like so. So as of now, all of the properties that are going to go inside these brackets are going to be affected to the element with the unique paragraph ID. So for example, let's change the color to purple and let's change the font weight to bold. As you can see, now our paragraph has a bold styling and it has the color purple. Now, what's the difference between a class and an ID? Well, it's very simple. So a class can be applied to multiple elements, while the ID can only be applied to one element. So an ID is always going to be unique. And what I mean by this is if we have, for example, another ID, let's call it second ID, for example, and this is going to have also a font weight of bold, but now it's going to have a color of yellow, for example. Now let's go back onto our HTML. And if we try to add a second ID, which is the one we created right over here, this second ID. So let's go ahead, copy and paste this. You can see that no more stylings are being applied on our element. And this is because the ID always has to be unique. It always has to be only one. But for example, let's say that we have another class and let's call this class make underscore bold, for example. And the only thing it's going to change is the font weight to bold, like so. Then going back onto our HTML, with the classes, we can actually combine different classes to different styles. So for example, on our third paragraph, we know that this is going to have the class change this, which will apply the color red, like so. But let's say that we also want this to be bold. Then simply type space and then the name of the class, make bold. So as you can see, now this element has two classes with two properties defined. The color red for the change this class and the make bold to make this paragraph bold. And we can also do this on the other item. So for example, let's say that on the second list item, not only we want it to have the home class, which changes the color to green, but we also want to make it bold. So as you can see, now we have two elements with the make bold class, but each of them have another different class to apply the color. With the IDs, this is not possible. The ID is always unique to an element. We cannot have multiple IDs on the same element. Okay, so let's go ahead and clean our styles.css file and let's start by understanding how colors work in CSS. So as of now, we've been changing the colors of our text by simply typing the name of the color. So for example, if we want to change the color of all of our header ones, then simply change color and say, for example, blue. And of course, this will change the color of our header onto a blue color. Now, this is good and all, but we sometimes want to have our specific color, right? So this is a predefined set of values that CSS has under the hood, but sometimes we don't want to use that set of values. We want to create our own colors. And there are two ways to do this, either using the RGB notation or the hexadecimal notation. Let's first talk about the RGB notation. So first of all, RGB stands for red, green, and blue. And this is because these are the three primary colors that we can use to create whatever color we want on the visible spectrum. And the way we do this is by actually, let's go ahead and delete our blue and let's type in RGB and then followed by a opening parenthesis and a closing parenthesis. Now inside we are going to have three values, one for the red value, one for the green, and another one for the blue. And the way we separate these values is by using a comma. like so. So for example, in this side, it's going to be the value for the red color, followed by a comma, and then the value for the green color, followed by another comma, and the value for the blue color, like so. So as of now, we've created a new color with a value of red of 0, value of green of 0, and a value of blue of 0. And this represents the black color, as we can see over here on our little black square, and as you can see on the color of our header. Now, the way our RGB model works is each value for the red, green, and blue is always going to be between 0 and 255. So these are the possible values that each of these colors can possibly have. So for example, if we add 255, which is again the maximum value that these values can have, you can see that our little square is now red. And this is because we are setting the red value to the max, while the other ones are going to be 0. So if we now save our file, we can see that our header now is red. Perfect. If we want our header to be green, then let's go ahead and put our red to 0, and then the green value to 255. So now we have a green header, and if we want to make it, let's say for example, yellow, then in case you don't know, the way we make yellow is by mixing green with red. So if we have the max value for green, and we also have the max value for red, as you can see, it gives us the yellow color, like we see here. Now, we don't always need to have the maximum color. And in this case, as you can see, we have a yellow color, but it's a little bit bright and it's not very visible because we also have a white background. So one way to fix this is to actually make the yellow color darker. And as we've seen before, the black color, it's going to be 000. So it makes sense that if we turn the values down, then it's going to have a darker color. So if we change these values to, for example, 200 and 200 on the green also, we can see now that we have a much darker yellow. Now, another way to do this is instead of typing in yourself, as you can see, if you hover your mouse on the color box, we get this color tool that can actually let you change all of the colors with a drag and drop. So for example, if we pick the cursor and then put it somewhere over here, you can see the values on the top changing for the RGB model. And then if we let it go, then it stays on that value. Now let's go ahead and save this. And we can see the changes being applied onto our header. If you want to change onto another color, then we can simply slide this over here, select a different color, and there you go. Now we have a bluish color. Perfect. Now the RGB model also has an option of adding a alpha channel onto the color. And what this means is basically the transparency of the color. And the way we do this is instead of calling in RGB, we are going to call in the RGB A for alpha. So of course, now we don't have 3 values. We are going to have 4 values. And the 4th value, it's going to be the transparency, so the alpha value of our color. And it goes between 0 being fully transparent and 1 being fully visible. So if we put 1, you can see that nothing changes. This is because the color is fully visible as of now. But if we put, for example, 0, you can see that it disappears because it's fully transparent. If you put something in the middle, for example, 0.5, you can see that it's still visible, but it is not as visible as if we had the value of 1. You can also change this using our toolbox by changing here the alpha channel. So completely visible, like so. And you can see that it took out the A for the RGBA, but if we now add some transparency, then it's going to add our A and the value of our alpha channel. Perfect. So this is how to create a color using the RGB system, but we also have the hexadecimal system. And we can do this by, first of all, let's go ahead and delete this. And the way we use a hexadecimal value is starting by a hash. And for now, let's go ahead and simply type 000000. And now I will explain what this means. So this is a hexadecimal value, and a hexadecimal value is another way to represent the same scale we had on our RGB system. So the scale from 0 to 255. But instead of being numbers, it's actually going to be hexadecimal values. And in case you don't know, an hexadecimal value goes from 0 to 9 and from A to F. Now, what does this mean? So, like we did onto our RGB model, we had the value for the red, the green, and the blue. And in this case, it's going to be exactly the same thing. But the first two values are going to be the values for the red, the second two values are going to be the values for the green, and the last two values are going to be the values for the blue color. So as I said, it goes from 0 to 9 and from A to F, being F the max value we can set on a hexadecimal value. Then it stands to reason that if we have 0, 0 as being a black color, then if we have FF on the red side, then it should give us a red value. So let's go ahead and delete the first two zeros and add a FF, like so. So as you can see, now we have a red color, and this is because we are setting the first two values, which represent the red color, to their maximum value possible, which is AF. If we add, for example, AA, then AA is not the maximum value for the red. It's somewhere in between 0, 0 and FF. So we have a darker red. If we want to make this blue, for example, let's go ahead and give the red value a 0. And then for the blue ones, which again, remember, are the last two values, we are going to add a FF. So now we have a blue color. Now we can also do a alpha channel like we did with the RGB system, by adding simply two more values for the alpha. So if we put 0, 0, then as you can see, we have a fully transparent color because this is a representation of a 0 alpha value. And if we want the max, then we simply set it to FF, which again is the max value we can have on a hexadecimal value. And it represents a full alpha value with a full visible color. If we go again onto our color toolbox, we can see that we can also change the values. And while as of now it's changing on the RGB model, we can actually click on it. And as you can see, it set us onto our hexadecimal model. So now if we change this, we can see the values of the hexadecimal format being changed to the corresponding color. Again, if we want the alpha channel, let's go ahead and move this slide. And as you can see, it adds the last two values representing our alpha channel. Okay, perfect. So these are the two ways we can create colors in our web page. And while there are more models to represent our colors, I can assure you that you only need to learn these two. Now, another cool thing we can do is not only change the color, but let's go ahead and learn a new CSS property, which is the background color, as you can see. So like we did with the color, we can set it either with the RGB model or with the hexadecimal. Let's go with the RGB first and set it, let's say, 255 reds, 100 green, and 58 blue, for example. So this gives us a more or less of a orange color. Now let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, it changed the color of the background of our header. So this is the way we can actually change the color of all of the backgrounds of all of our elements. So if we want to change, for example, the color of the background of all of our paragraph, let's go ahead and select background color. And let's give it a blue violet. And as you can see, the blue violet is a predefined CSS value, but it has here the hexadecimal value of that color. So let's go ahead and click this, save it. And as you can see, now all of our paragraphs have the blue-violet background color. If we change this, for example, the color to white now, then the text itself has a white color and the background has the blue-violet color. Perfect. So another good property to know is the CSS border property. And what this does is actually change the border width, color, and style of all of our elements. So for example, let's go ahead and change the border of our paragraphs. And the property is called border. And as of now, I'm just simply going to input these values over here and I'll explain in a bit. Okay, and as you can see, we now have a border onto our paragraphs. So what does this mean? There are three set of values for the border. The first one, it's going to be the width or the thickness of our border. So in this case, I put 1 pixel. But if we put more, for example, 10, we can see that we have a much thicker border. Let's go ahead and put it back onto 1. Actually, let's put it onto 2. Yeah, something like that. So the third one, it's going to be, well, surprise, surprise, the color of our border. So it can be something else like red. It can use the RGB notation like we learned, or it can use the hexadecimal. So whichever one you prefer, you can input the color right over here. And then this third value is going to be the style of our border. So the typical one, it's solid, which is a solid border, as we can see here. But we can add, for example, a dotted style, and this will give a few dots onto our border. We can have a dashed style, for example, and we can add a bit more crazy ones like, for example, the double, which gives us 2 lines for each border, or the groove, for example, ridge, and so on and so forth. So we have different types of borders which you can actually test it and implement it in your own style. Now, one cool thing you can do with the borders is actually change the radius of the borders. So let me explain that with another example. Let's go ahead and change our headers, and let's give it a border of 4 pixels, solid, and then a red color, like so. Now, as you can see, our border is very rectangular, but let's say we want to give it a little bit more of a rounded corners, right? So the way we do this is using the property border radius, like so. And the border radius accepts a value on pixels. So for example, if we add 0 pixels, it's going to stay the same, nothing changes. But if we put, for example, 1 pixel, then probably you cannot see because it is a very low value, but it actually changes the corner rounding. So let's go ahead and increment our value, for example, for 10. And now we can actually see the changes. So now we have a rounded corner on all of our borders, like so. If we want to go really extreme, like for example, 100 pixels, then it gets completely circled on the edges. Now, one cool thing about the border and the border radius is that you don't necessarily have to have the border all around our element. We can set it in a specific position. So for example, in our H2, let's go ahead and copy the border from the H1, like so. But now let's say that we don't want to have on all of our element, but we want to have it simply at the bottom. Then the way we do this is border minus and then bottom, like so. So as you can see, we now specified to add a border only on the bottom of our element. And of course, we can do the same for the top, like so. Let's put this for example, green color. We can put it on the left with, again, a different color, for example. And finally, we can put it on the right one more time with a different color. Perfect. So we can actually select the side of the element we want to border or not. And then we can actually do the same with the border radius. So let's say we want a rounded corner, but only on the top left. We can actually say border top left radius, like so. So now let's go ahead and say, for example, 10 pixels. And as you can see, we now only have the top left corner rounded. Let's do the same for the bottom right, like so. And perfect. So now we have a normal corner on the bottom left and on the top right, and a rounded corner on the top left and the bottom right. Perfect. Okay, so let's start now by understanding what are pseudo classes. So as we've seen previously, we know how to create a class for an element and how to change the styling for all of these classes. So for example, if we said that this header had a class of name, let's say class 1, and then this paragraph also had the same class 1, then if we type in class 1 and then change the stylings, this will change the styles for our header and our paragraph because they will be the ones with this class. Now, pseudo classes behave much like classes, but we don't actually define these classes on our HTML. Rather, these are classes that already exist on our CSS, and they work like this. So let's go ahead and first of all say we want to change the styling of our header 2. So let's go ahead and give it header 2, and let's change the color to red, like so. So we know that we have 2 header 2s in our HTML, like we've seen here. So we have this first one, and then we have the second one. But now let's say that we want to style not only the header 1, but all of the header ones that are a first child of an element. And the way we do this is by using the first child pseudo class. So to represent a pseudo class, let's go ahead and at the front of our element, type in a colon and then first child, like so. So as you can see, now we don't have both of our H2 elements with the red color, but rather only the first one. And if we go back to our HTML, this is because, as you can see, the second header 2, it's actually going to be the second child of this element right over here, right? While the first header 2, it's going to be the first child of our header element. So this is the only one that's going to have the styling applied because this is the only first child in an element. Because this is not a first child, it's the second one, then it's not going to have the styling affected. Now, of course, this doesn't only affect one element. This can affect as much elements as needed. And we can see that by saying the following. Let's change the list item that is a first child, like so, and change the color to blue. And as you can see, we change the color of the first list item and then again the first list item. And this is because both of them, as we can see on our HTML, they are the first child of their parent element. So the first list item is in fact the first child of this ordered list element. And then the second one is again the first child of the unordered list element. We can also change the styling of the last child. So last child, like so. Let's give it a font size of 20 pixels. And as you can see, we change the fourth element of our ordered list and then the second element of our unordered list. And this is because both the home list elements are the last childs of their parent elements. Now, if we want to change a specific element, then the way we do so is, again, the name of the element, followed by column. And now, instead of being first or last child, it's going to be the nth child, as you can see here. So nth child, and then open parentheses to represent the child we want to change. So in this case, let's go ahead and say we want to change the third child. So every list element that's going to be a third child of an element are going to have the styles applied. Let's change the color on to red, like so. Okay, perfect. Now, as you can see, we've changed this list item over here onto a red color, but nothing gets affected over on this list because there is no third element on this list, only on the first one. Perfect. Another cool thing we can do with this pseudo classes is we can actually change by even or odd numbers. So for example, let's say we want all of our even numbers. So it's going to be n child. And then instead of typing in a specific number, we are going to type in odd, for example. And let's say we want to change the background color of all of our odd childs onto a, for example, blue-violet color. So as you can see now, all of our odd list items are going to get these styles applied. If we change this to even, then it's going to be on the even numbers. Okay, so another set of pseudo classes we have is whenever there is an action performed on an element. But before we get into that, there's actually a special set of pseudo classes to handle hyperlinks. And to demonstrate the first one, let's go ahead on our HTML page and let's add a new link. So let's go ahead and copy this. And let's say that this is going to have the text empty link. So now let's go ahead and remove the reference. And now we have a third link, but the third link doesn't have any reference. So as you can see right at the start, it has a different style than the other links. But what we can actually do now is say, for example, let's say that we want to change the color of all of our links for a red color, like so. Then, of course, it's going to change all of our links. But now let's say that we want to change the style of all of our links that have a link, and it's going to be with the link pseudo class, like so. So now, for example, if we change the font size to something like 40 pixels, then as you can see, all of our links that do have a link, which are going to be the awesome website and the go to page 2, are going to have the font size of 40 applied. The last link, because it is empty, then it's not going to have this style applied to it. Now, of course, this doesn't make much sense, but let's say that we want all of our hyperlink elements that do have a link to remove the underline of the text. And we can do that with the following property, which is the text decoration, and then set it to none, like so. Okay, perfect. So now we removed the underline of all of our hyperlinks that do have a link. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's delete this red color, like so. And one cool thing we can do is use the visited pseudo class. And again, this is going to be specific for the hyperlink elements. Of course, this is not going to work with another set of elements, only with the hyperlinks. And let's say we want to change the color to like a blue violet, like so. So every time now the user clicks on the hyperlink, we can see that it changes the color of all of the visited websites. So let's go ahead and click on go to page 2, go back. And as you can see, it changed the color from blue to a blue-violet color. Another useful pseudo class is the hover one. And I can assure you that this is going to be one of the most used ones. And what it does is apply a style every time the mouse is hovering on that element. So let's say that every time the user hovers a hyperlink, we want to change the color, not to a blue-violet, but something with a alpha channel, so it has a little bit of a transparency. Go ahead and save this. So now if we hover, we can see that it applies the alpha channel, making the text a little bit transparent. So every time we hover an element, it should apply the style, like so. And the same will happen on our empty link because we've defined the set of rules onto every hyperlink. But if we want, for example, to make it that the style only applies onto these two, then what we can actually do is combine these pseudo classes. So let's go ahead and add also the link one. And now the style will only apply on hover on all of our A elements that do have a link. So let's go ahead and save this. And if we try it now, as you can see, it only changes the ones with a link, not the empty one. Perfect. So let's try, for example, on our header ones. So every time we hover, let's change the font size to something very big, like 40 pixels, like so. Now, if we hover on our header, we can see that it changes the font size to 40. If we take the mouse off, it goes back on to the previous set of values, like so. The last useful pseudo class is the active one, and this is applied every time the user clicks on a element. So let's go ahead and try with our header 2 elements. So it's going to be the active pseudo class, and let's change the color to red. So now if we go on to a header 2 element, for example this one, and we click on it, we can see that it changes the color to red, and it will remain so as long as we keep pressing the element. As soon as we let go the mouse, it goes back onto the previous defined values. So now let's say that on our HTML file, we have the following elements. So it's going to be a header 1 element, and it's going to have a ID with the name header ID, and then it's going to have a class with the name header class. Then in our CSS file, we have the following class selector, so the header class. We have the ID selector for the header ID, and then we have the element selector for all of the H1 elements. And for each, we say that we want to apply a different property. So for example, in our class selector, we want to change the font weight to bold. For the ID selector, we want to change the color to red. And then for the element selector, we want to change the color to green and the font size to 14 pixels. So now the question is, which one of these styles are going to be applied onto our element? And the answer is quite simple. So every style is actually going to be applied to the element because this element has the correspondent ID, the correspondent class, and the correspondent element selector. So our element now is going to have a font weight of bold, a color of red, a color of green, and then a font size of 14 pixels. But as you can see, this doesn't make much sense, right? So it has a duplicate property with different values. So which one of these is going to be applied? And in order to know this, we first need to know how CSS prioritizes selector conflicts. So CSS has a mechanism that gives a lowest priority to a certain type of selectors and then a highest priority also. And let's start with the lowest priority one, which is going to be the universal selector. And don't worry about this, we are going to talk about this more later, but as of now, just bear in mind that this is the one with the lowest priority. We then have the element selector. So if we are dealing with a element selector, then we know that it's going to have a highest priority compared to the universal selector. We then have the class selector, the ID selector, the inline styles. So the style we define on the HTML element and not in the CSS file. And then finally, the important value. And this is a specific type of value which you can append on whichever value you want to change, and it will always be the one with the highest priority. So independently of having the styles, ID selector, class selector, or element selector, once you marked that value as an important, represented here by the exclamation mark followed by the important, then it's going to have the highest priority and it's going to override all of the other styles. So if we take into account our previous example, we can see that the color red comes from the ID selector and the color green comes from the element selector. And as you can see from our order list, the ID selector takes priority over the element selector. So at the end, this element it's going to have the color red and it's not going to have the color green because the color red has a higher priority than the color green, so it's going to overwrite it. Now, any other case you might find is that we have a duplicate on a selector with a different set of properties and values. So for example, right over here, we have a header 1 selector and then we have another header 1 selector, but one with the color red and another one with the color green. And when this happens, then the priority goes to the last one. So in this case, it's going to be the last header 1 selector and not the first one. So our element, instead of having the color red, it's going to have the color green because again, this is the last selector that we find in our file. And of course, this is true not only for the element selector, but also for the class and the ID selector. So every time there is a duplicate, the one that takes priority, it's going to be always the last selector. Another very important concept to understand is the concept of inheritance. And like the name suggests, this simply means that some elements can actually inherit properties from their parents. So let's see that in action. Let's say we want to change from the article the color to red. Now, before we save, let's go ahead and check our article element. So as we can see inside our article, we have 3 paragraphs, but we are not actually changing the styles of the paragraphs, right? We are changing the style of the article. But the article itself doesn't have necessarily any kind of text to actually change the styling of the color. But if we go ahead and save this, we can see that it changed the color of all of its children paragraphs. So you can say that all of the 3 paragraphs inherit the styles from our article. For example, if we were to change not the article, but all of the paragraphs inside an article, we could see that it didn't change because this is the same as changing only the color from the article. Because again, all of its children are going to inherit the styles from their parents. So let's do a more extreme case. For example, instead of changing the color from the article, let's go ahead and change the color from the body element, which again, don't forget, it's the one with all of the content we want to render to the user. So if we go ahead and save this, we can see that we now have changed the color of all of our elements in the document. Now, one thing you need to understand is that not all properties are going to be inherited by the children elements. In fact, only the text properties are going to be inherited. Every other property are not going to be inherited by the children. So let's go ahead and see this. Let's say we want to change the font size to something like 14 pixels. Because this is in fact a text property, then it should, in theory, apply to all of our elements. So let's go ahead and save this. And as you can see, all of our text has been changed from the font size. But now let's say we want to change the border from our body to a something like 3 pixels, solid, and then green color. Now, because this is not a text property, as you can see, only the body element is going to have the border applied. All of the children elements are not going to have the border property. Again, why? Because this is not a text property. If it is, then it's going to be applied to all of its children. Another thing to note is that while every children is going to inherit the parent styles, we can actually overwrite it by giving another property on the specific element. So for example, let's go ahead and say that we want to change the header 1 styles to have a color of green. Now, as you can see, our header 1, it's going to have the color of green and not a color of red because we are overwriting the property from the parent element. So if nothing is specified, then the element is going to inherit from the parent all of its styles, unless we specifically tell that no, we want this element to have a different style. Then in that case, CSS is going to override the styles from the parent element. But now let's say we are stubborn and we want to actually change the border of all of our elements inside our web page. And as you can see, we cannot do that by defining on the body because, once more, only the text style elements are going to be applied to the child, but we can actually use what is called a universal selector, and it is represented here by the multiplication symbol. Again, open the brackets, and what this does is apply a certain style, doesn't matter if it is a text style or a border or whatever you prefer, to all of the elements present in our web page. So now if we go ahead and copy this, remove from the body, and simply put it on our universal selector, then as you can see now all of our elements are going to have the border applied. And of course, this universal selector can be used with another selector in between. So for example, let's say that we want to apply the borders not to all of the elements of our page, but actually to all of the elements inside a div container, for example. Then we simply type in div followed by the universal selector. So now all of the elements inside a div are going to have the following styles. One important concept you need to understand is the CSS box model. And by default, all of our elements are always going to have this model. But of course, we can change that, but more on that later. But it is important to understand, as this is the most common used model on all of our elements, and it is important for you to understand this so we can later manipulate margins, paddings, widths, and heights of all of our elements, but more on that later. So the box model consists of the following. As an example, the text we see over here is considered a paragraph element. And the element will have, first of all, the content. So it's going to be the area inside where we have either another element or a text or an image, etc. Now, outside of our content, we are going to have the fill area. And this is the area that is going to be able to change the color of the background of our element. So whenever we change the background color property in CSS, we are actually changing the color of this fill area. Outside the fill area, we have the border, and we've already seen this. We've already created a few borders for our elements, but now you know that the border is the line that's going to be around the fill area of an element. And finally, we have the outer parts. So this is not going to be stylable, meaning that we can actually change the color or a border or wherever we want. But this is the actual outer part of the element. So it's where an element begins and ends. So for example, if we had another element to the right of this one, then the other element invisible outer part would be starting right over here and then continue forward to the right. We then have the margin, and the margin is simply the distance between the outer part and the border of the element. So whenever we increment the margin, we are incrementing the area between the border and the invisible outer part. The same thing can be done from the content and the border, and this is called the padding. So the same way as we have the margin for the border and the outer part, we now have the padding from the content to the border. And if we increment or decrement, then we are going to also increment and decrement the fill area. Finally, we have the width and the height of our element, which, as the name says, represents the width and the height, so the size of our element, which it's going to be the size of the content of the element. So this can be a little bit vague for now, but once we get onto the margins, paddings, and the width and the heights, then you get a more concrete sense of what this is. But it's good to know that this is the default model of our elements, and it's good to know each one of these properties and how you can manipulate them to actually change the stylings of your elements. Okay, so now that we know how the box model works, let's go ahead and show a few examples on working with paddings and margins. And to do that, let's go ahead and create a new element, and it's going to be a div container. And inside, let's go ahead and create another div. And inside this one, a simple span saying testing, margins, and paddings. Perfect. Now to be able to select the correct element, let's go ahead and add a class. And this is going to be called the parent class. And the div inside, it's going to be called the child one. So now if we go on to our styles, one thing I like to do to debug the margins and the paddings is to always change the background color of the element so I can have a visual cue on how they are behaving. So let's go ahead and change our parent class like so. And don't forget that you have to add the dot to reference a class. And let's go ahead and also do the same for the child. So first of all, let's change the background color of our parent to something like red, for example. So as you can see, we already see the red background color. And let's change the child elements to a background color of green, yellow, like so. Perfect. So now you only see the green, yellow background color and not the red one. And this is because we know that the child element is inside the parent one, so it will be on top on the screen. We then have our span element with the text. But now let's go ahead and already change a few of the paddings and the margins. So let's go ahead and change to our parent element. And let's give it a padding for now of, let's say, 20 pixels, like so. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we now have this space in between the child element and the parent element. And this is, in fact, the padding of the parent element. So don't forget that the padding is always inside of the element, and then we can do the same with the margin to add some space outside of our element. So again, let's give it the same value of 20 pixels, like so. And as you can see, we now have a little space outside of our parent element, and this will correspond to the 20 pixels we've defined. We can also do the same for the child element. So let's go ahead and add these same 20 pixels for the margin. And as you can see, it looks like we do have, in fact, a 40 pixel padding on the parent, but we actually have a 20 pixel from the parent and a 20 pixel margin from the child element. Again, you can also change the padding of the child element. So let's go ahead and do this. Now we have 20 pixels inside the child element. Perfect. Now, another way to do this is, instead of having a padding and a margin on the whole element, you can actually choose the side to which you want to apply the margin and the padding. So for example, for the margin, you can actually select, as you can see, the margin top, bottom, left, and right. And of course, this will apply the margin onto the specified side. So let's go ahead and, for example, choose the top one, and let's give it a 24 pixel. And as you can see, we now have this 24 pixel space in between the navigation elements and our parent element. We can do the same with the padding. So let's try and add a padding bottom, and let's give it a 24 pixels also. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, now the child element appears to be on top of the parent element. And this is because we are telling the parent element to have a 24 pixel on the bottom of itself. If we want to add some space on top of the child element, then we can do so, adding the padding top and then 24 pixels, like so. Let's test also with the left value. So let's give it a lower value, like for example 12 pixels, like so. And there you go. Now we have the padding on the left. So now you know how to apply the margins and the paddings on the whole element and actually select a specific side to apply these values. But this can be a little bit confusing, or maybe you don't like to have all of these attributes just to change a specific side on our element. So one way we can actually solve this is by using a shorthand of all of these values. And this can be applied to the margins and to the paddings. So what I mean by this is, let's go ahead and delete everything. And let's return to our previous example of adding the padding of 20 pixels onto the parent component. So as of now, the style is being applied on the whole component. But let's say that we want to apply to a specific side without using the padding top, bottom, left, or right. So add another value, let's say 20 pixels, and then another, and then another. So the padding can actually contain up to 4 values. And as you can see, nothing changed. This is because we are telling all of the values to be the same, but this first value represents the top value of the element. This one, it's the right value. This one is the bottom value, and this one is the left value. And a way to remember this is that the first value always starts from the top of the element, and then the rest goes clockwise. So starting from the top with the clockwise orientation, then we are going to get next one, the right one, and then the bottom, and then the left. So let's go ahead and try to change this. Let's say that we want to change the bottom value to have 10 pixels. So don't forget, start from the top, then we get the right one, and then we get the bottom one. So let's change this to 10. And as you can see, all of the other sides are going to have a 20 pixel padding, except the bottom one, which is going to have 10 pixels. So now let's change the left one. For example, let's say it's 5 pixels, like so. Okay, perfect. And we can do the same with the margin. So for example, let's say that we want to add a margin only on the top and the bottom. So you would go, for example, 40 pixels. Then, of course, we don't want on the side. So the next one, it's going to be the right one. Let's go ahead and add a 0 pixel. And then a 40 pixel, and again, 0 pixel, like so. Perfect. So now we have the margin only on the top and on the bottom. Now, when we are on these specific cases on which we want to change only one orientation, either it's on the x-axis or the y-axis, then you can even short this by deleting the last 2 values and just leave it with 2 values. So if you leave it with 2 values, the way that CSS interprets this is the first values are going to be on the y-axis, so the top and the bottom, and then the second value, it's going to be on the x-axis, so on the left and on the right. So if we want to change, for example, the sides, let's go ahead and add 10, and as you can see, it added 10 pixels on the left and then 10 pixels on the right. Perfect. So let's see how we can now manipulate the size of a element. And let's take in the previous example. So this parent element with the child element with the text inside. And let's go ahead and try to change the width and the height of our elements. So again, just in order to see what we are doing, let's go ahead and first of all, add the parent selector and the child one like so. And let's again add a background color of red, and for the child, a background color of green, just so we can see what we are doing when changing all of these values. So the first one we can change is the height of an element. And again, we have been working with pixels so far. So let's go ahead and start with our pixels. And let's say that we want our parent element to have a height of 40 pixels, like so. So as you can see, it already changed the height, and this element will now be 40 pixels tall. We can actually add a little bit more, so we have some space to work with, like so. Perfect. And we can also change the width to something, let's say, for example, 20 pixels. Perfect. And as you can see, now the parent element has only 20 pixels. And one thing you might notice is that the child element is going to adapt its width in regards to the parent. And this is something we will talk later when dealing with the display property. But for now, just know that the child element is going to adapt always its width to the parent element. Okay, so now let's try and do the same for the child. Let's say that we want the height to be something like 60 pixels. Okay, perfect. And then the width 100 pixels, like so. Okay, perfect. So now, as you can see, we can actually change the width and the height of our elements to a specific set of values. Now, one cool thing we can do is actually take our image here as an example, and let's try and change the values of our image. So input the image selector like so, and let's give it a, let's say, a width of 200 also. Okay, as you can see, now our image does in fact have a 200 pixel width, but it gets a little bit distorted. And this is because the image, while having a different width, is not in scale to the original image. So now what we want to do is to actually set the height onto the specific value so we maintain the image ratio. So let's say that we want the height to be, let's say for example, 100 pixels. This seems still a little bit off. Let's try in incrementing a little bit more. Better, but I'm not sure that this is the original aspect ratio of our image. So instead of going manually and trying to figure out what is the correct value, one thing you can do is actually change the height to the auto value. And what this will do is CSS will try and figure out the image size and adapt the height to the width while maintaining the aspect ratio of our image. So for example, if we now add a 300 pixels to the width, then you can see that not only the width increment in size, but also the height to maintain the aspect ratio of the image. And of course, we can do the same with the height. So let's go ahead and set a predefined height of, let's say, 300 pixels, like so. If we change the width to something like this, you can see that we get a completely distorted image. But if we add the auto, then it's going to always maintain the aspect ratio of our image. Of course, the same can be done with our video. So let's go ahead and change the width of our video to something like 200 pixels, and then just leave the height out so it maintains the scale of our video. Perfect. So now we know how to work with pixels and the automatic value for the height and the width. Another type of value we can use is the percentage value. And let me show you with an example. So let's go ahead on our parent and let's add a width of 400 like so. And now let's say that we want to change the width of our child depending on our parent. So for example, if we leave the width omitted, we can see, as I told you before, that the element is going to try and expand to the full width of the parent element. But let's say that we don't want it to be to the end, but we want to be a specific percentage in regards to the parent. So let's say that we want the child element to have a width of 80% the width of the parent element. So as you can see, now the child element will have only 80% of the size of our parent, leaving the rest with the 20%. And now if we change the width of our parent, for example, for 200, we can see that it maintains the 80% in regards to the parent. We can set this, for example, to 50. So we have the child element always with half the size of our parent. And then again, the same, if we change the values, it's going to adapt to the value of our parent element. Of course, the same can be done with the height. If we want the height to be, for example, half the size of the height of the parent, then we can also do the same by adding a 50% on the height. So don't forget that the percent is always going to be in regards to the parent element. So if we do this, for example, on our parent element, let's go ahead and say that we want 80%, like so. Then as you can see, it's going to be relative to the parent element, and the parent element of our parent right over here, as you can see, it's going to be the body element. So it's going to be 80% the width of our body element. Okay, so now that we know how margins and paddings in widths and heights work, as well as how to work with the percentages and also with the auto value, then let's go ahead and do a little trick that's very useful in all of your websites, which is centering elements. And to do so, let's use the parent as an example, and let's add a height of 200 pixels, like so. Perfect. And now let's say that our child element is simply going to have a width of 100 pixels. Okay, perfect. So now we have this child element over here, and we have this parent. and we want to center the child element onto the center of the parent element. So how can we do this? We could go ahead and in our child element, go ahead and add a margin, for example, on the left of, let's say, 50 pixels, for example. And we can go ahead and try to add the correct value. So let's say that it's 200, for example. Okay, no, that's too much. So let's go and try, I don't know, 160, like so. Almost there, 170. Okay, that seems better. So now let's go ahead and add a margin top of, again, let's say 80 pixels, like so. Okay, so now we have our margin top on the child element, but as you can see, it also pushed the parent element. So now we have to go on to the parent and add, for example, a padding top of the same value. So 40 pixels. And well, it kind of seems centered. And you can go about and change all of the values and try to make it center, but then you will have a problem, which is the screen resize. So if the user, for example, change the size of our screen, then you can see that the element no longer is centered. So this is not a good solution. One way to fix this is, first of all, let's go ahead and delete all of our margins and the paddings, like so. And what we want to do is actually say that we want our margin on the left as a auto value. And what this does is going to fill the margin on the left with all of the available size in regards to the parent. So in this case, it's going to be all of the size over here, pushing the child element onto the right. And now we simply need to do the same, but on the right side. So auto, like so. And as you can see, now we say that we want the margin on the left and on the right to be automatic. So to fill the available space in regards to our parent element. And now you could simply add a padding on the top, on the parent element, let's say of 40 pixels. And then we can see that it stays centered on the x-axis. So now if we try to resize the window, as you can see, it always stays centered in regards to the parent element. Perfect. Now, unfortunately, you cannot do the same with the y-axis. And this is because if you try to add a margin, and let's go ahead and try this, a margin on the top of auto, then the value is actually going to be computed to 0. So it's not going to change, and it is not possible to center the items vertically using the margin auto property. But don't worry, later when we'll talk about positioning modes, then I'll show you another way to actually center not only on the x-axis, but also on the y-axis. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about the display property. And in order to visually help us see this, let's go ahead and, as we've seen before, let's use the universal selector. And don't forget that this will apply the styles to all of our elements in our page. And let's say that we want to add a border to all of our elements of 1 pixel, solid, and then the red color, like so. Okay, perfect. So now all of our elements have a border. And what I want you to notice is that some elements, for example, the headers, like we see here, they have the width right until the end of the parent element. But then we have a few elements that do not behave like this. So for example, the links over here, we can see that the width of this element, it's not going to be the same size of the parent element, but it's actually going to be the size of the content inside. And you can see that also with the paragraph over here. On the paragraph over here, we can see also on the bold element and on the italic element. But then on the other ones, you can see that it actually extends to the end of the width of the parent element. And this is because some of these elements, like the header over here, have a block display, while others, like for example our links, have what it's called a inline display. And this will change a few properties of our element. So let's go ahead and test this. So one of the properties of a block element is that it's actually going to occupy 100% of the parent's element's width, no matter the content inside. Not only that, but the elements are also going to be stacked vertically by default. So for example, if we check this div over here with all of our headers, we know that the headers will all be of type block. So they will all fill the width with the rest of the width of the parent element, which in this case, it's going to be the div, and they will be stacked one on top of the other. But let's go ahead and change this behavior. So let's select our div, and let's start with the header one, like so, and then select again the div with the header 2, and let's select a third one, which will be the header 3. So we are going to change the header 1, 2, and 3 inside a div. And again, they are defaulted to display block. So if we add display block, nothing changes. But now let's go and change this to inline. See what happens? Now the behavior of the element changes, and this will change a few things. So the first thing that it's going to change is the width of the element, and it's going to fit not the parent of the element, but the actual content inside this element. So as we can see, for example, here on the links, we can see that the width is of the size of the element. So a hyperlink by default is a inline display element. The next property we can see is that they do not stack on top of one another, but rather they are going to be in front of one another. Again, the same as we see on our links. Another very important property about inline elements is that the heights and the widths do not work if we try to change it. So for example, let's say we want to change the height for 200 pixels. As you can see, nothing changed. And if we try the same with the width, again, nothing will change. And this is because the inline elements always set the height and the width to the size of the content itself. So if you are trying to change the height and the width of an element and you see that nothing happens, then probably the element will be of type inline. Now, another very important piece of information is that inline elements do still have the paddings and the margins, but they only work horizontally. So let's say, for example, we want to change the margin at the top and the bottom, and then on the sides, we don't change anything. Again, as you can see, nothing happens. But if we now add on the horizontal space, you can see that it does in fact change the margins. And the same can be said with the padding. Okay, so bear this in mind when working with elements, because there is a chance that you are trying to change the values of these heights and paddings and it's not working and you don't know why. And now you know that probably that element will be of type inline. And a few of the elements that default to the inline display are, as I said before, the hyperlinks, so the anchor elements, and also the images, strong, emphasize, the buttons, and a few more text-related elements. So bear that in mind. Okay, so now we are going to talk of something that I do consider one of the most important concepts you have to understand about CSS, which are the positioning modes. And this is a concept that if you understand fully, then you can create a few cool stuff with your websites and make your life a lot easier. For example, I said before that if you want to center an element, you can do so horizontally using the margin auto, but not vertically. And with the positioning modes, you can actually quite easily do this vertically and horizontally. So let's go ahead and see what this is all about. Okay, so let's take an example, this div right over here with all of these headers. And let's go ahead and add a ID and call this the container, like so. And now let's go ahead and change the style of this container. So again, don't forget to reference a ID, it's with the hash symbol, followed by the name of the ID, like so. So let's start by adding a background color of, let's say, red, but not actually red. Let's actually add a little bit of opacity so we can see clearly the text, like so. Perfect. Okay, so as of now, we've been changing the position of our elements using either the margins, the paddings, and then the widths and the heights of the elements. But what if I told you there is another way? And this is by using the position property of CSS. So let's go ahead and add, again, the container, because we want to select the header one of this container element, like so. And again, just for debugging purposes, let's go ahead and add a background color of, let's say, green yellow. Okay, perfect. And let's actually make this with the size of the content. So what we can actually do is add the width property and then say fit content. Perfect. Now let's say we want to change the position of this element. So we can add a new property, which is the position, and it's going to be of type absolute, like so. And as you can see, something already happened. So now our header 1, it's going to be a absolute position, and to be able to change the position of this element, we can actually go ahead and add a new property, which is the top one, and then change to a value, let's say, for example, let's say 0 pixels. Okay, perfect. So now as you can see, it changed the position onto the top of our page. We can also do the same with the left. So left 0 pixels, for example. Okay, and now it's on the left. Perfect. Or we can do the same with the right. So let's say we want the element to be on the right of our page, then simply add the right with 0 pixels, and now it's going to be on the right. Now, one thing you might notice is that this element is inside our container in our HTML, like so, but it's being positioned in regards to the page itself. And we don't actually want to do that. We want to change the position of our element in regards to our container element. So what we have to do is change the position of our parent to the relative value. And what this means is that now our header 1, which is a absolute position element, will have its values relative to the first relative parent. So again, I'm going to repeat. Whenever you set an element to an absolute position, the positions you change are always going to be relative to the first relative parent. And what I mean by this is, let's go ahead and let's add another parent. So div, like so. And let's copy and paste inside. And let's add the ID of this one as a grandparent. So now if we change the stylings of our grandparent, so hash grandparent, open brackets, let's add another background color. So again, we can see what we are dealing with. And let's add a padding of 80 pixels. Okay, perfect. So now we have our grandparent element, our parent element, and our header. First of all, let's just fix a quick thing, which is, as you can see, we have the top with 0 pixels, but it's not actually on top of the element. And this is because, remember that the header 1 by default has a margin. So let's go ahead and remove that margin, set it to 0 pixels. Okay, perfect. And now indeed it is on the top of the element. And what I'm trying to say is that, let's say that we don't have this relative position over here on our container, right? Then as you can see, it goes on to the next relative element, which is the page itself. And now let's add it on our grandparent, the position relative. And as you can see now, our absolute element, it's going to be relative to the grandparent and not the container element. Again, because this is the absolute element, it's always going to be relative to the next relative element up our HTML tree, which in this case, it's going to be the grandparent. If we add the position relative again onto our container, then it's going to be relative to the container because it is the first relative position element when we go up the HTML tree. I hope this makes sense because this is really important knowledge that you can then use to do a lot of cool stuff in your web page. Okay, perfect. So now that we know this, let's go ahead and change a few of our values. Let's say that we don't want the top to be 0 pixels. We want it to be 20. Okay, so as you can see now, it's 20 pixels from the top of the parent element. And let's go ahead and do the same for the right. Okay, so now let's say that we want this element to have the top and the right and whichever value you prefer. You can add the bottom and the left also. But let's say we don't want it to be relative to the next relative parent. We want to be actually relative to the screen itself. One way to do this is, instead of adding the position absolute, we add the position fixed. So whenever an element has the position absolute, it's always going to be relative to the next relative element. But if we set it to fixed, then it's always going to be relative to the screen. So for example, let's try with another header inside our container element, the header 2, for example. Let's add a background color of yellow. Perfect. And let's add a position absolute. So it's going to be relative to our parent. And let's say we want it on the bottom. So bottom 0 pixels. Again, don't forget that the header elements have margin. So let's go ahead and remove the margin. And now we have our header element on the bottom relative to the parent. If we want relative to the screen, then simply change this to fixed, like so. And as you can see, it stays fixed to the screen. And when I say it is fixed to the screen, I really meant it. So for example, if we revert this back to absolute, the same for the header 2, for example, okay, they again are relative to the parent. And if we scroll the page, we can see that they stay relative to the parent, right? But if we change this to fixed, as I said, it's going to be relative to the screen and not to an element. So what this means is if we now scroll, as you can see, they stay at the same position relative to the screen. So no matter the size of the elements inside or the scroll position, it's always going to be relative to the screen. So if you change the screen size, as you can see, the bottom one, it's always going to be relative to the screen. Okay, perfect. So we've already talked about pseudo classes, but now let's talk about pseudo elements and the same way that the pseudo classes work. So we don't actually have a class defined in our HTML file, but CSS is going to inject that pseudo class. The same can be said with the pseudo elements. So it's an element that's not being defined by us on our HTML page, but we define it on our CSS, and then later CSS will inject onto the HTML DOM tree. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's select all of our paragraphs. And don't forget that to use a pseudo class, we always start with a column, but to add a pseudo element, it's actually going to be 2 columns. So 1 column for a pseudo class, 2 columns for a pseudo element. And let's start with a first pseudo element, which is the first letter. And as you guessed it, what this is going to do is actually change the styling of the first letter of all of our paragraphs. So for example, let's set the font size to something like 40 pixels. Go ahead and save this. And as you can see in all of our paragraphs, the first letter, it's going to be way bigger than the rest of the text. And this is because we are changing the font size of the first letter of all of our paragraph elements. Another useful pseudo element is the first line. For example, let's go ahead and open brackets. And let's say that we want the first line to have a color of red, for example. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, all of our paragraph elements are going to have a red color. And this is because they are all the first line. But now let's go ahead and add a few text on, let's say, for example, this paragraph. So I'm just going to type random characters like so. Save this. And as you can see, we now have the first line of this paragraph as a red color, but not the second line. And what's cool about this is that if we change the size, you can see that it dynamically changes also the color of the text, depending if it is on the first line or not. Perfect. Now, sometimes we want to add a new element that's dependent on some kind of CSS rule, but we don't necessarily want to do it with HTML. So one way we can do this is, again, let's go and this time let's change the header 1 and let's add the pseudo element, which is the after. And the after pseudo element has a strict necessary property, which is the content property. So content, and this can be whichever string you prefer. I'm just going to go ahead and say, for example, hello. And as you can see, we now have this element concatenated after the header 1 element. So the after, as the name says, is going to add an element after our h1. But we can also do the same before. So let's go ahead and copy this, paste it, and change the after to before, like so. So now, as you can see, we have a new element before our header and after our header. And you might be thinking, but why is this useful? Why can't I just add a new HTML element? Well, Typically, what this is used for is to add some kind of tag or something onto a element. So for example, let's say that our H1 element, it's going to be with a relative position, right? And for now, let's go ahead and simply delete the before element. And let's say that our after element, it's going to have a position of absolute. So now it's going to be absolute relative to the parent component, which it's going to be the header one. And now let's change a few styles. So let's say that we want, first of all, not to have the same font size. Let's say we want something really small, like 12 pixels, for example. Okay, perfect. We want to have a background color of, let's say, green, for example, dark green, like so. Let's change the color of the text to a white. Perfect. Let's add a little bit of a padding. So let's say, for example, 2 pixels. Let's make this rounded. So don't forget border radius, and let's say 4 pixels. Perfect. And as you can see, we have a somewhat kind of tag on top of our element without actually creating that element on HTML. This is good because instead of adding a new element on all of our headers, we can simply type this CSS rule, and we now know that every time we have a header one, then it's going to have also a tag. So for example, if we want to add on to all of our paragraphs, then simply change this to P, like so. And now we have a tag on all of our paragraphs. If we were to do this with HTML, then we would have to manually add a new element on all of our paragraphs. So this can make our lives easier. Okay, so now let's learn something that will be very useful throughout your development process, which are the Chrome Dev Tools. So most browsers usually come with a set of tools that can help you with the development process, and we are going to see the ones on Google Chrome. So there are 3 ways to open Chrome DevTools. The first way is to actually go here on the top, click View, at the bottom Developer, and then click on Developer Tools. And this will open this window over here. Another way to open is to actually click on the page with the right click on the mouse and then select Inspect. So again, this will also open Chrome DevTools. And then the third and final way is to use a shortcut, which in Windows, it's going to be Control-Shift-I, and on Mac, it's going to be Command-Option-I, like so. So once you open your Chrome Development Tools, you can see that we have a few tabs over here, but we are only going to focus on the Elements tab. So let's go ahead and click this. And the first thing you can see is the full HTML of our page. So it's exactly the same thing we have in our HTML document. And one cool thing about this is that if you hover with your mouse on the top of the elements, you can see that they get highlighted. And this is very cool if you want to see a specific element and see some of its values. So for example, if we click on the ordered list one, you can see that not only we have a blue color, but we also have a green and orange color. And what this represents is the blue for the size of the content, the orange is the size of the margins, and the blue is the size of the paddings. And you can actually see that right here at the bottom on our Styles tab. So as you can see, we have this little box over here, and this represents the box model we've discussed, as well as the values for all of the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. So as of now, we have selected the body. So what we are seeing here is the box model for the body element. But let's go ahead and select the ordered list like we were seeing before. And if we now check the box model, we can see that we do in fact have the correct value. So for example, if we hover on the content, it's going to have, as you can see, the sizes here, it's going to be 951 for the width and then 74 for the height. If we hover onto the padding, again, we can see that we have a 40 padding, but only on the left, and we have no value set at the bottom, top, and right value. For the border, we have no value, so it's going to be blank. And then on the margin, again, if we hover, we can see not only on the screen, but we can see that it has 16 on the top and 16 on the bottom. Now, let's go ahead and open this a little bit more so we can see it better. And one thing you might notice is that we have these styles over here. And these are actually the styles of the current selected element. Now, of course, we didn't type these styles, and we can see that by what it says here, user agent style sheet. And this is just another name to say that these are the default values of this element. So in this case, the ordered list element is always going to have this predefined set of properties, which is the display block, list style type decimal, and so on and so forth. So if we select another element, and not only you can select all of the parent elements, but if you want to select a specific item inside the element, then let's go ahead and click on the arrow. For example, this one. Let's open again. And as you can see, we now have all of the child elements over here. So if we select, for example, the header one, again, we have the box model for the header, and we also have the predefined values of the header one. If we go back onto our CSS file and let's say we want to change the color of the header for something like reds and change the font size to something really large, like for example, 40 pixels, like so. So we can see the style being applied. And if we check our style tab for this element, then you can see that we now have this h1, which is in our styles.css file. And we have, in fact, our color over here and the font size of 40 pixels. Not only that, but you can see that we have this strike over here on the font size. And this is because we are actually overriding the font size by setting up in our CSS file. Now, one thing you can do with the Chrome DevTools is to actually change the styles of the elements without changing our CSS file. And that can be done here on the element.style. So this is the same as the inline style we checked earlier. And this will in fact change the styles of the element and take priority over everything else. So for example, if we now say that we want the color to be green, as you can see, it changed the color to green and it override the values we had on our CSS file. And this is a good way if you want to test something on an element before adding on to your CSS file. And don't worry, this will not override your CSS file. As you can see, we still have the same attributes. And the good thing is that if you're not happy with this, then you can simply go ahead and refresh the page, and it defaults back onto the values we set on our file. So it is a good way to test certain styles on the elements. Another cool thing you can do is to actually test all of the pseudo classes of an element. So for example, let's say we want to test the hover or the click or something else and check the styles of that element. So for example, let's say that we want to add a pseudo class of hover, like so, on our h1 element, and every time the user hovers our h1, then we want to change the background color to green. Not only that, but we also want, for example, add the active one. So every time the user is clicking on the element, we want to change the color of our text to blue. Okay, so one way we could test this is actually do the user action. So if we hover the mouse, we can see that it changes. And then if we click on it, then we can see also the value. But there are certain scenarios where you won't be able to do this. And one way to test this without the user action is to actually go over here at the style tab. And you can see this column hover. And if you click on it, then now we have a few element states. And with this, you can actually go ahead and test all of the different element states and see their styles applied. So for example, we know that the background color is going to change to green whenever the user hovers, and we can confirm that by clicking here on the over. So as of now, this element, this h1 element, it's going to have the over pseudo element, and as you can see here, it adds from our style CSS the style we've defined for the hover pseudo element. If we click, for example, on action, then again, it's going to activate the styles we defined on our CSS file, and it's actually going to overwrite the previous one. So this is a good way for you to test all of the element states and their applied style. One final thing, if you want to select a specific element, you can do so by going onto our HTML document. But if our HTML is vast and complex, one easy way to do this is, for example, let's say we want to change this item 1 over here, then simply hover the mouse on top of it and then right click and choose inspect. So as you can see, now we have our list item selected. So this is a more simpler way to actually select an element instead of going through the HTML page and then selecting said element. Okay, so before we get into the project, let me just start by saying that you don't have to memorize all of these CSS and HTML rules. You always have your best friend, Google. So whenever you have some kind of doubts or a question, you can always search on Google. So for example, let's say we want to make an element disappear every time the user clicks on it. So what we would do is type in HTML, CSS, make element disappear on click, for example. And as you can see, we already have a few pages right over here. And I'm going to recommend a few of them. And the first one that's going to be the holy grail of all of them, it's going to be Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow is a website that has a lot of questions and answers of everything related to computer science. So for example, if we click on this, the typical structure of Stack Overflow is we have the question made by someone, followed by a few examples. And then if we scroll on to the bottom, we can see that we have a few answers trying to fix the problem that the user has. So if you are by any chance stuck on something, always try Google and take priority over Stack Overflow because there is a high chance that your problem has already been solved. Now, again, as I said, you don't need to remember all of the CSS and HTML rules. You can actually always look them up. And a good website for that is actually the W3 Schools, like so. And let's go ahead and view this. And what we want to do is actually select the language. So in our case, let's go with HTML. And as you can see, it has a ton of explanations regarding HTML elements. So for example, the HTML div right over here. And as you can see, it has a brief explanation of the element and what it does and how you can use it. So if you ever forget something, then go over here and check the elements and what they do. And you can also do the same for CSS. So if we click on CSS over here, then again, we have all of the CSS properties and what they can do. So for example, the position we've talked about, and it shows a few of the examples. And then you can actually go ahead and try it yourself. And it will open up this editor on the browser. And then you can simply go ahead and change right in the browser. So for example, if we change this to 30, click on run, you can see that it already changes the elements, so you can test it out. Another very good reference is actually the developer Mozilla. So let's go ahead and type that. And it's going to be this one, the MDN Web Docs. Let's go ahead and click this. And to be honest, I think this is a better alternative to W3 Schools, but again, it's up to you. You decide which one is better. If not, use both. And what we want to do is go on to the references. And then as you can see, we have the references for the HTML and CSS. So for example, for the CSS, you can see that we have, again, a few of the properties, like the border one, for example. And if we click, we do have a brief explanation and a few examples on which you can test it and try it yourself. So whenever you get stuck or you don't remember certain property or rules, then go to these websites and I can assure you that you will find more information regarding it. Welcome to the project we are going to build in this course, and it's going to be a simple portfolio website which you can then use as a template if you want to make your own portfolio and showcase your projects and talk a little bit about you if you want to present it to a company or a recruiter. So let's see what we have here. The first thing we see is the main page. And it starts with a brief description of who you are. And if you want to learn more, then we have this About Me link, which will take us on to the About page. We then have a profile picture, well, in this case of a dog, but of course you can change this to whatever you prefer. And then at the top, we have the header with the logo of our portfolio and a few hyperlinks to the other pages of this website. Finally, we have at the bottom of the page a simple footer with a text. So if we go on to the About page, we can see that we have a more detailed description of who you are. And don't mind the text over here. This is just template text, but you can go ahead and change this to whatever you prefer. Next, we have the projects page. And this will show a few images of your projects. And as you can see, when the user hovers with the mouse, it changes the styles of the images. And not only that, but these are actually hyperlinks. So if we go ahead and click on it, then you get redirected to a web page you define. Now, going on to the service page, this is a page with a view that you can use to describe a little bit more about your services or whatever you prefer. So as you can see, we can go ahead and play this, pause it, full screen, and then we can go back to the home page. Perfect, so let's go ahead and build this. Okay, so as we did before, let's go ahead and create a new folder. Let's call it Portfolio Website, like so. Now let's go ahead and open a new Visual Studio window. Let's go ahead and drag this. And let's open a Google Chrome window and then put it side by side, like so. Let's go ahead and add some space to our code editor. Perfect. And let's start by opening our Explorer and click on Open Folder. So go to your desktop and then open the Portfolio Website folder. Perfect. Now the first thing we want, remember, it's the index.html, like so. Let's go ahead and close this. And let's start by creating our basic HTML template, which will be, first of all, the doc type. So doc type, like so, with the HTML attribute. Now below, it's going to be the HTML tag, followed by the language attribute to the EN for English value, like so. Let's go ahead and open this. And first of all, we are going to need a head element, like so. And then below, we are going to have the body element. Perfect. We can already add a meta tag, and it's not going to have content. So let's go ahead and close this. And let's give it a charset attribute of UTF-8. So to let the browser know that this is going to contain the English alphabet. So now we should have all that is necessary to start our server. So let's go ahead and click on Go Live. And perfect, we now have our HTML. We can already go ahead and change the title. So let's go ahead and create a new title element, like so. And let's give it the name of my portfolio. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we changed the name on the tab. Let's go ahead and already create a new style CSS. So open the Explorer, new file, and then type in styles.css. Again, you can name this file to whatever you prefer. Let's go ahead and close this. And let's go back onto HTML so we can link our style CSS to this HTML page. So go ahead and create a link element, and we can go ahead and close this already. Again, no content needed. And then href attribute to reference the style.css file. And of course, the type of relationship, so the rel attribute, is going to be a style sheet. Perfect. Now let's see if this is already working by going on to our styles. And let's try and change the body background color to something like, for example, hash to represent a hexadecimal color, and then 262626, like so. Okay, perfect. So as we can see, it is in fact working, and we changed the background to a grayish color. Okay, so let's start by creating our header navigation here at the top. So first of all, it's going to be inside of the body, and it's going to be a header element, like so. And the first thing we are going to have is a hyperlink, and inside it's going to have the name portfolio, like so. Okay, so as you can see, we already have the hyperlink here. And what this hyperlink is simply a navigation to the main page, which will be the current one. So let's go ahead and add the href attribute. And instead of referencing the index.html, what we can do is actually reference the first path by putting a forward slash. And this simply means that instead of going to the specific index.html page, then it's going to go, as you can see here, onto the main page. So forward slash, and it's going to be the main page. But remember that browsers interpret the index file name as the main file. Then what it's going to do is, once we are on the main path, it's going to search for the first file name with the name index. And in this case, it's going to be the index.html, so it will load the same file. Perfect. Now, the second thing we need is the actual navigation. So let's go ahead and create a navigation element. And this is where we will have all of the other pages. So let's go ahead and simply copy this and paste 1, 2, 3 navigation paths. Perfect. And the first one, it's going to be the About page. The second, it's going to be the Projects page. And then the third is going to be the Services page, like so. So don't forget, again, to reference the files, and we can already go ahead and create them. So open the Explorer, and the first page, it's going to be the about.html. The second one, it's going to be the project.html. And the third one, it's going to be the services.html. So one HTML file for each page. Perfect. For now, let's leave the other pages empty and let's just focus on this main one. So don't forget to change the reference for each hyperlink to the page. So the about, it's going to be the about.html, then the project, and the services. Perfect. Now, before we continue to the rest of the elements of this page, I think we can already go ahead and start styling a little bit of our page. So let's go on to our styles.css. And first of all, I want all of our text for all of the page to be of color white. So instead of putting the color white in each individual element, what we can do, don't forget, because text attributes in CSS get inherited by the children, then we can go ahead and on the body, already type in color and then white. So of course, this is not going to change the hyperlink because it is a special case, but we know now for sure that all the rest of the text is going to be of white color. I also want to add the font family to every element to be the sans serif, like so. And as you can see, it actually did change on the hyperlink. So let me go ahead and comment this out, save it. See, it's a different font. So let's go ahead and bring it back up. And there you go, perfect. Now let's go ahead and already change our hyperlinks. And what I want to do is, first of all, let's go ahead and remove the underline. I don't want that. Okay, perfect. And let's specify that we want the color to white. Perfect. So as you can see, the hyperlink did not inherit the white color. So we had to explicitly say on this element selector. Now I want this header over here, which will contain all of this, to be a little bit off from the top. So let's go ahead and create a new header selector, like so. And let's add a margin on the top of, let's say, 24 pixels. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, we now have a little bit of a space from the top. Now, what I want to do is to actually pick up this navigation wrapper. So if we go back to the index.html, we know that these three hyperlinks are inside this container over here. And what I want to do is pick this container from here and push it onto the right. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and change our navigation, like so. And let's make it a position absolute. So now we know that we are going to be able to move this relative to a parent element. And what I want to do is, first of all, set it on the right. So right 0 pixels. As you can see, it's now on the right. And I want it to be on the top of our parent element. So let's go ahead and top. It's going to be 0 pixel. Perfect. But as you can see, it's not relative to our header. It's actually relative to the first relative parent, which will be the body element. So let's go ahead and fix that. And on our header, let's add a position relative. Okay, perfect. So now it is on the top, but relative to the header element. So if you go ahead and inspect this, give it a little bit of space, we can see that the navigation container is indeed on top of our header element. Okay, so the next thing I want is to add a little bit of space in between our hyperlinks. So let's go ahead and add a margin of 6 pixels, like so. And don't forget that because this is by default a inline block element, then the margin is only going to be applied on the x-axis. Now we do have a problem. I don't want to have the margin on this hyperlink over here. I just want on these ones. And we know that these ones are inside our navigation container. So instead of adding the margin over here, let's go ahead and add it on a new one. So it's navigation and then hyperlink. So A, and then add the margin. So now we only want to apply the margin to every hyperlink that's inside a navigation container. Perfect. Next, I want to add a little bit of a opacity every time the user hovers a hyperlink. So let's go ahead and actually copy this. So I only want to apply on the hyperlinks on the navigation. So paste it over here. And I want to use the pseudo class hover, like so. And what I want to do is change the color of the text to, first of all, it's going to be white. So let's go ahead and use the RGB. So RGB. And it's going to have a opacity, so a alpha channel. So let's go ahead and add A. And then for the white color, it's going to be the max value for the red, the green, and the blue. But now instead of having one opacity, I actually want to have it, for example, 0.7. Perfect. So now if we hover with our mouse, we can see that the color fades a little bit to add the sense that the user is within a clickable element. Perfect. Now I want to do some changes in this portfolio hyperlink specifically, so let's go ahead and add an ID to our portfolio hyperlink. So ID, and let's call it simply logo. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and reference it. So to reference a ID, it's with the hash and then the name of the ID. And what I want to do is, first of all, change the font size to be something bigger, like for example, 32 pixels. Okay, perfect. And I want to have the weight of the font to be bold. Perfect. Now, one problem, as you can see, is that now the hyperlinks are not within the same range of our logo. So let's go ahead and change our navigation. Instead of being all the way onto the top, let's go ahead and give it a little bit of space, like 20 pixels. And perfect, so now we have our header finished. Let's go ahead and already create the footer. So before we go in onto the specific content of the page, we can already go ahead and add a new footer element, like so. And this is going to be simply a text, but again, you can go ahead and put whatever you prefer. And I'm just going to go and say made by someone. So as you can see now, the footer is here on the top. So what we now have to do is style it to be always on the bottom of the page. So let's go on to our style CSS and let's change the footer element. So footer, like so. And we want this to be with a absolute position, like so. And we want it to be on the bottom. So bottom 0 pixels, and then on the left. So left 0 pixels. Okay, perfect. So now it's here on the bottom of the page. And if we go ahead and inspect this, we can see that the footer has the width of our text, but we don't want to do that. We actually want to make it a full width. So width 100%, like so. So it now takes the whole space of the screen. And now what we want to do is center not our footer, but our paragraph element relative to our footer. And in case you forgot how we do this, it's using the margins auto. So let's go ahead and select the footer paragraph. So every paragraph inside the footer. And let's add a margin of auto, like so. Now, this doesn't change anything because if we go ahead and inspect it, you can see that the paragraph's width occupies also the full width of the parent. So it's not going to center the paragraph. And in order to fix this, what we need to do is set the width of our paragraph to fit the content. Perfect. So now it is centered relative to the screen. So if we go ahead and change this, you can see that it's always going to be centered. Perfect. Now I don't want to be all the way to the bottom, so let's add a little bit of space. Perfect. And let's make the text a little bit smaller. So font size, let's say 12 pixels, like so. And so it's more visible. Let's change the weight to something like, for example, 700. Okay, perfect. Again, before going on to the main content, there's something I want to do, which is make the size of our page fixed and then centered on the page. So as of now, if I go ahead and increase this, you can see that we get the portfolio logo right here to the left and then the rest to the right. And I don't want this. I want it to be centered. So one way we can do this, let's go ahead and push this back and let's go to our style and let's change our body element. So at the top, right over here, let's make it a fixed width. Let's say 400 pixels, like so. Now, as you can see, this doesn't quite work when handling smaller screens. So because we add a fixed width, then as you can see, it goes off the screen. So we have to scroll it, and we don't want that. So instead of adding the width, what we can add is something called the max width. And as you can see now, it's not scrollable. And this is because the width, it's going to be adapted to the size of the screen. So as you can see, if I put it smaller, the width, it's always going to be the size of the screen. But if we go ahead and increment the screen size, you can see that at certain point, then the width, it's going to stay fixed. And this is because now this has a max width of 800 pixels. So once the width gets higher than that, then it's going to stay fixed to the value you define. Okay, perfect. And now to center our page, the last thing we need to do is actually set the margin to auto. Perfect. And as you can see, we have the page centered with a max width. So if we go ahead and push this all the way to the left, we can see that it stays centered. And if we go ahead and decrement the screen size, it's going to adapt to the full width of the screen. Perfect. We can also add a little bit of a padding on our margin, not on the y-axis, but on the x-axis. Like so. So now we have a little bit of space. Perfect. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start making our content. And below the header and above the footer, let's go ahead and create another container. It's going to be a simple div one. And it's going to have, first of all, a header 2 saying, hello, my name is, and then below that, it's going to have a header 1. So it's going to be bigger. And then you just put in your name. So in my case, it's this one. And then below we have a header 3 saying, and I'm a developer, like so. Okay, so now we have our text. Let's go ahead and add now a paragraph to reference the user to the next page. So if you want to learn more about me, click on the link below. Perfect. And then, of course, below we are going to have the link. So a hyperlink saying about me, and it's going to reference the about page. So a giraffe about.html. Perfect. So if we now click on our link, we can see that we get redirected to the about page, which in this case is still nothing. So let's go ahead and already style this. And because we are going to have multiple div containers, I want to separate each one of them with a specific ID. So let's go ahead and on the first one, let's add an ID saying main container. So this is going to be the main container for our main page. So back on our styles, at the bottom, let's go ahead and reference our main container. So hash main container, like so. And then let's go ahead and center this by adding the position absolute. And the top, it's going to be 40%. So if we go ahead and resize our window, we can see that the top is going to change always with a percentage relative to the screen. Perfect. Now I want to add a specific width. So let's say 400 pixels, like so. And then one thing I don't like is all of this space in between the text. So what we can do is instead of going one by one, we can actually reference again our main container. And then let's go ahead and use the universal selector. So to select all of the elements inside this container. And what we want to change is the margin to set it to 0 pixels. Okay, perfect. So now we don't have any kind of margin in between our elements. So let's go ahead and change our header 1 from the container. So main container header 1, like so. Let's change the font size to something big, like for example, 48 pixels. Okay. And now let's add a margin bottom because we do in fact want a little bit of margin from this element of about 6 pixels. Now the header 2, let's go ahead and main container, header 2, like so. Let's change the font size to something smaller, like 18 pixels. Okay, perfect. And let's also change the font weight to something like 500. Okay, perfect. Now for the header 3, let's go again and reference the main container, then header 3. Let's change the font size also to something like 24 pixels. Okay, perfect. And let's give it a thinner text. So font weight of 500, for example. Okay, perfect. And let's add a lot of space in between this one and the paragraph below. So margin bottom, let's say 48 pixels. Yes, perfect. Now, one thing I want is this developer text to be bold. So let's go ahead and go back onto our index.html and let's wrap our developer text right over here onto a bold element. So copy this, put it inside, and perfect. We now have this bold. But I don't only want it to be bold, I actually want it to change the color. So let's go ahead and reference the bold element. So main container, it's inside the header 3 and it's the bold element. And let's change the color to a purplish color. So I'm going to go ahead and add a custom color. It's going to be 6366F1. And of course, you can go ahead and tinker with it. You can go ahead and use the color tool and then change to something you would prefer. Finally, for the paragraph, the only thing I want to do is add a margin on the bottom so we have a little bit of a space in between the hyperlink and the text. So margin bottom, 12 pixels. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and style our hyperlink, and because this is going to be something that's going to be used in the other pages, we can actually define a specific ID. So let's call this next link, for example. And let's go ahead and style this next link ID selector. So next link, like so. And let's start with the background color. So I want it to be also purple, but a little bit darker. So let's go ahead and add this one. So 3.1, 2E, and then 8.1. Okay, perfect. Now we want to add a little bit of a padding from the content to the border. So 12 pixels for the y-axis and 24 pixels for the x-axis. Okay, perfect. And as you can see, we now don't have the spacing between the paragraph and the hyperlink, despite having the margin button over here. And this is because, don't forget that the hyperlink, it's always going to default the display to inline. So it's not going to affect the margins outside. So let's go ahead and change that and say that we want this display to be blocked. Okay, so now we should change the properties. It respects the margins from the block display, and it's going to fill the width to the width of the parent. But of course, we don't want that. So let's go ahead and change the width to fit the content. Perfect. Now let's make it full rounded. So let's add a border radius of 100 pixels. Perfect. Let's change the font size to 14 pixels. To be a little bit smaller, but let's add a font weight of, for example, 900, so it's a little bit bolder. Finally, let's add a border of 1 pixel, solid, and then white. Now, to me, this is not very pleasing, but what we can do now is actually change the alpha channel, like so. So it's going to fill with the RGBA, and what we want to add here is a 0.1. So it's going to be white, but very, very, very transparent. So now we get this white border, but it is very subtle. Next, I want to change the background color when the user hovers. So let's go ahead and select our next link, and then add the pseudo class of hover. And it's going to be the same background color. But let's remove a little bit of the transparency. So let's go ahead and add a 0. So it's going to be roughly in the middle. So now if we hover, we can see that it gets a little bit more transparent and the user has a visual cue that this element is clickable. Okay, so we're almost done with the main page. The only thing missing is our image. And you can go ahead and download it from wherever you want. I already have a profile image over here. So let's go ahead and open our Explorer, and I'm just going to go ahead and drag and drop our image onto the Explorer. So it's going to be this photo of this dog. Let's go ahead and close this, close the image, back on our HTML. On the bottom of our hyperlink, let's go ahead and add a image element. So go ahead and close it. It doesn't have any kind of content. We can already go ahead and add the alternative text, which is going to be profile picture. And then let's go ahead and reference our file. So it's going to be profile.png. Perfect. So as you can see, we now have our image. So let's go ahead and style this. So here where we are dealing with the elements of the main container, let's go ahead and deal now with the image. So main container EMG to select the image element. And the first thing we want to do is set this position to absolute, like so. And then let's add a top of 0 pixel, so it stays on the top of the parent element. Let's already change the width to something fixed, like for example, 400 pixels, like so. Okay, perfect. And because we know the width of our image, it's going to be 400 pixels, we now want to set it on the right with minus the size of our image, so 400 pixels. Okay, perfect. So there you go. We now have our image over here. Let's also make the corners of our image rounded, so border radius, but not fully rounded, so something like, for example, 12 pixels. Okay, perfect. And let's add the same border we add on the next link. So go ahead and copy this and just paste it right over here. Perfect. So as you can see, we now have a kind of white border on the image. And that's it. So we now have our main page. So let's go ahead and start making the about page. Okay, so now for the about page, what we are actually going to do is select all of this HTML, copy, and then let's open our about HTML like so, close this, and let's simply paste it like so. Perfect. So now if we were to go onto the about page, you can see that it's going to be exactly the same thing. And this is because we are actually going to use the same header and the same footer, but the only thing that's going to change is the container over here with the content. So let's go ahead and actually delete this like so. And let's change the ID for about container. So again, this is going to be a different container. The first one was for our main page, and this is going to be the container for our about page. Now inside we are going to have again our image. So it's going to be the profile one, source profile.png like so. And it's also going to have a alternative text saying profile picture. Let's go ahead and close the tag like so. And then it's going to have another container, so a div one. And inside it's going to have a header one for the name. So I'm just going to put in my name. And then it's going to have some random text. So it's going to have 3 paragraphs. And again, you can change this to whatever you prefer. And the way I typically generate text, it's by using the lorem ipsum generator. And in case you don't know that, let's go ahead and open a new tab on Google and type in lorem ipsum generator. So it's going to be the first one. And in case you don't know, lorem ipsum, it's kind of a meme, let's say, because no one actually knows where this comes from. Some people might tell you that this came from Lapton, while other people say that this has been a industry standard for the typeset industry ever since the 1500s, but it doesn't matter where it came from, only that it is something that developers and designers usually do to actually fill in text. So let's go ahead and scroll a little bit more, and you have this generate lorem ipsum button. So let's go ahead and click this. And now we have a random text. So let's go ahead and copy a few things. Let's copy this onto this paragraph, like so. Copy the next onto the next paragraph, and then just one more to the final paragraph. Perfect. So now we have some random text right over here. Now let's go ahead and style this. So on our style CSS page, let's start with the image. So let's reference the about container and the image element. Let's change the width of the image to 400 pixels like we had on the main page. Perfect. And again, the border radius of 12 pixels and this border right over here. So let's go ahead and copy this and paste it over here. Okay, perfect. Let's change the div inside our about container. So it's going to be the wrapper for the text. As you can see over here, it's this div. So reference the div like so, and it's going to be a position absolute, so we can put it on the right like so. The top is going to be 0 pixels. Perfect. And don't forget that this is going to be relative to the about container. So let's go ahead and change that also. The about container to a position relative. Perfect. Now we are going to set on the right, and it's going to be minus the size of our image, right? but we want to add a little bit of a space in between the text and the image. So let's go ahead and add 10 pixels like so. And in order for this text to fit in the screen, let's go ahead and add a width, the size of the image minus the 10 pixels we want to leave as a space in between. Now, of course, our text is going to be way over here because as of now, our about container is going to have the width of the whole screen. So it stands to reason if we add the div to the right, then it's going to be, as you can see, to the right of our container. So what we have to do is actually change the size of our container to the width of the image. Like so. Perfect. So now our text is going to be next to the image. Now I want to do the same as we did with the other container. So it's going to have a top of 40%. But of course, this is not going to work because this is not a position absolute element. Now, one thing you might think about is that, well, we have this div inside our container that's going to be an absolute element, and we want it to be relative to this about container. So we have to have the position relative. But we also want to change this to a position absolute. So how does this work? Well, a good thing to know is that when you make an element with a position absolute, it's actually also going to be relative. So as you can see, nothing's changed except that now our container is going to be absolute relative to the body element, and that our div inside our about container, it's also going to be absolute, but relative to the next relative parent, which is going to be the about container, because again, a position absolute is also relative. Okay, perfect. Now let's go ahead and change a few things with our text. So about container inside the div, and it's going to be the h1. First of all, from the header, I think it's okay, except the margin. So I want to remove the margin from the top. Like so, so we have our text aligned with our image. And then for our paragraphs, let's change the font size to something like 14 pixels, like so. And let's change the color. So let's leave it, first of all, to white. So we can now change the alpha channel. So let's go ahead and change this, like so. And let's leave it at 0.7. The next thing we are missing is the link to go on to the next page. So let's go ahead and open our index.html. And now let's simply copy the link for the next page and paste it on our HTML right below the last paragraph. Perfect. Now the only thing that we want to change is, first of all, it's going to be for the project's HTML file, like so. And let's change the text to say something like, for example, check out my project. Perfect. And as you can see, since this as the next link ID, then it's going to inherit all of the styles that we've defined for this specific ID. So as you can see, we can use the same stylings on different pages. Perfect, so that takes care of the about page. And now for the projects page, it's going to be the same thing. So let's go ahead and copy all of this and let's paste it inside our projects.html. So now simply remove everything inside our content container, like so. Change this ID to be project container. Perfect. And let's go to the projects page. Okay, perfect. So now we have the basic template with no content. So let's go ahead and create our content. Okay, so the first thing we are going to do is download a few images to represent our projects. And again, you can go ahead and choose whatever picture you prefer. I'm just going to go ahead and add a few images I already have here. So I'm just going to open my Explorer and then just drag and drop my images. Perfect. And as you can see, I named it as a project 1 PNG, 2, 3, and 4. Now, inside our projects container, what we are going to do is, first of all, let's change this from a div to an unordered list, because this is in fact going to be a list of items. So UL, like so. And the first list item, so LI, like so, is going to be 2 hyperlinks. So let's go ahead and add the first one and then add the second one. Okay, so as you can see, we now have the dot here for the list item. And inside each, we are going to add a image element. So let's go ahead and do so. So the first one, it's going to reference the first image. So project 1 PNG, like so. And then the second one, it's going to reference the project 2 PNG. Perfect. Now, before we continue, let's go ahead and already style this so we can see a little bit better. And let's start with our images. So it's going to be, don't forget, inside our projects container, like so. And it's going to be all the images. So the first thing we are going to do is change the width. And again, we know that the size of the body, it's going to be 800, and we want to have 2 pictures side by side. So we can say that the width, it's going to be 400 pixels, like so. But we actually want to add a little bit of a space in between. So instead of being 400, let's leave it as a 390 pixels. Let's already go ahead and style a little bit of our images by, first of all, add a border radius of 12 pixels, like so. And the same border we have on our other images. So let's go ahead, copy and paste this, perfect. And now let's go ahead and do the same as we did with the other containers. So let's go ahead and change this to a position absolute, like so. And let's add a top of, instead of being 40%, let's give it only 20%. So we have a little bit closer to the top of the page. Perfect. Now I want to make this dot over here disappear. And the way we can do that is to actually add a new property. So it's going to be called list style, like so. And let's give it none. So let's remove all of the list styles in this container. Okay, perfect. And if we go ahead and inspect this, we can see that we have this green padding on the left. And this is because this is a default value for the unordered list. So let's go ahead and remove this. So on our container, simply add a padding of 0 pixels, like so. So as you can see, now the screen has the correct size to fit the 2 images side by side. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add the other 2 links. So let's go ahead and copy this list element and simply paste it right below. Now let's change this to go fetch the 3rd image and the 4th image. Perfect. Also, let's go ahead and add a href for our links. And I'm simply going to go with Google for now. So HTTPS. Remember that you have to have the protocol if you want to open a web page outside your own web page. And then www.google.com. So if we click on it, then we can see we get redirected onto Google, but we don't want it to change the current page. So we want it to open a new tab. And in case you forgot to do that, we had to have the target attribute and set it to _blank, like so. So now if we click on the item, we can see that it's going to open a new tab. Now let's simply go ahead and copy this. So the href and the target attribute, and let's paste it on all of our hyperlinks. So the 2nd one, the 3rd one, and the 4th one. Okay, perfect. Now, of course, you can go ahead and change these references to reference the pages you want the user to go to. Now, what I want to do is every time the user hovers an image, I want to make the image a little bit more transparent. So first of all, let's go ahead and select our projects container, like so, the images inside, and the pseudo class of hover, like so. And a CSS property to change the transparency of an element, it's the opacity property. So if we leave it like 1, you can see that nothing changes. If you leave it like 0, then if we go ahead and hover, the image disappears, like so. But we want to leave it as a 0.6. So now if we hover, we can see that the image gets a little bit transparent. Perfect. Now let's go back into our index.html and let's copy the link for the next page. So go ahead and copy this, go onto our projects HTML, and right below the last list item, let's go ahead and create a new one, like so, and add our next link reference. Now, of course, this is going to go onto the services HTML page, and let's change the text to something like see the services I offer, like so. To make this hyperlink centered, let's go ahead and change the styling. And we know that this already has all of the stylings that we've defined earlier here at the top on the next link. But let's go ahead and on this specific one, let's go ahead and add some more styles. So to select the specific one, we have to first of all select our projects container, because again, this is going to be the one inside the projects container. And then the next link ID, like so. So to center, very simple, margin, auto. Perfect. Let's also add a little bit of a space on the top, so margin top, 24 pixels. Perfect. So we're almost done. The only thing we're missing is the service page, and you know the drill. Let's go ahead and copy all of the HTML from one of the pages, and then just simply paste it onto our services HTML. So go ahead and paste this, close the Explorer, perfect. And let's go ahead and change the content. So delete all of our list items, make this a regular div, like so, and call this services container. Let's go on to our services page. Okay, perfect. And inside our container, it's going to be very simple. So we want to add the video. So don't forget, it's going to be the video tag, like so. And inside, it's going to have the source for the video. So create a source element and then a source attributes, like so. Close this. Perfect. And again, you can go ahead and use whatever video you prefer. I'm just going to go with the one I already have here. So I'm just going to drag this, and it's going to be a .mp4 video. So bear that in mind. And now I'm going to reference the video.mp4, like so. Okay, perfect. So here's our video, and let's go ahead and style it. So don't forget, first of all, select the services container. So services container, and then the video tag, like so. Now let's set the video width to be the same as it is on the body. So it's 800 pixels. Perfect. Let's add the same border radius we add onto the images, so 12 pixels. And let's also add the border. Now for the container itself, so services container, let's do the same as we did with the other one. So position absolute, and let's give it a top of 20%. Perfect. Now the last thing we are missing is the hyperlink to the homepage. So go ahead and copy and paste it on the bottom of our video, like so. So this is going to go onto the main page, and don't forget that to do that, it's going to be /, like so, and then change the text to something like, let's say, back to homepage. Perfect. Finally, let's just add a little bit of a margin from the video to the hyperlink. So go ahead and select our services container, select our next link. Let's first center it by adding the margin auto, like so. And finally, a margin top of, let's say, 24 pixels. Now, as of now, this is not clickable and it's not playing, so let's go ahead and fix that. And I don't actually want to autoplay like we did on our examples, but I want the user to have full control of our video. So on the video element, let's add a new attribute called controls, like so. And there you go. So now the user can click on the play button, pause, change the audio, make it full screen, and a few more options. Okay, so now that we have our portfolio finished, there are a few things that I think we can still improve. And the first one, and most simple, is actually change the name of the pages depending on the current user page. So as of now, if we go on to another page, like for example the About page or the Projects page, we can see that it's always saying My Portfolio, and I don't actually want that. I want to change depending on the current page. So let's go ahead and do that. First of all, let's open the index.html, and at the top, let's change the title to My Portfolio, followed by main. So we know that we are now on the main page. Now let's do the same for the other pages. So let's start with the About one. Again, on the top, change the title to My Portfolio and then About. Do the same for the other pages. So Project, and finally Services. Okay, perfect. So now, as you can see, depending on the current page, then we are going to have a different title on the tab of our browser. Now, another thing I want is to change the stylings of our navigation to let the user know which page it's currently on. So what I want to do is, depending on the page, I want to change the text color to a specific primary color. So in our case, it's going to be purple, but again, you can go ahead and choose whatever color you prefer. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's just close these files, and on our styles, let's create a new class, and it's going to be called current link. like so. And the only thing it's going to do is change the color, as I said, and let's change it to something, for example, 6366F1, like so. Now, back in our pages, we have to go ahead and add these classes to the current navigation. And of course, the index HTML, it's not going to change the logo. We want the logo to stay always white, but we want to change it in the other pages. So let's start with the About one. And we know that we are currently in the About page. So we want to apply the styles of the current link to the About hyperlink. So let's go ahead and add a class with the name current link. Perfect. So as you can see, now we get a purple color when the user is on the About page. But if we go ahead and hover, we can see that the previous styles on the hover is still applied, and we don't want that. So let's go ahead and copy our current link class, paste it on the bottom, and say that we also want the color to be the same one when we hover on a current link element. Perfect. So if we now go ahead and hover, we can see that the color doesn't change. Now let's go ahead and copy this class and paste it on the respective hyperlinks depending on the page. So on the projects one, it's going to be the second one right here. And then on the services, it's going to be the third one. So right here. Perfect. So now if you go ahead and change the page, we have a highlighted text depending on the current page. Now, the last thing I want to do is to change the logo we see over here. So as of now, there's no logo. So we are going to get the default depending on the browser, but we want to add our specific logo. And one way to do that is by searching on Google, favicon generator. So it's going to be the first one. So real favicongenerator.net. And then you can go ahead and select a image of your choice. But for this demo, I'm just going to go with a random image. So I'm going to click on the demo. And then as you can see, we first get a preview of how it's going to be on the browser, on the desktop, and then for mobile devices like iOS and Android. Now, what you want to do is scroll to the bottom and then simply click on the Generate Your Favicons. So now go ahead and download your package and just save it on your project, like so. Now go ahead and open your project folder and simply unzip the file, like so. Inside, you are going to find multiple files, and each file is going to be for a specific device. But in our case, we are just dealing with websites. So the only two images we are interested are the favicon 16 by 16 and the 32 by 32. So let's go ahead and simply drag this onto the top of our folder, like so. So the first one and the second one. And we can go ahead and delete this. We don't need it. And also the zip file, like so. So if we go ahead onto our Explorer, now on VS Code, we can see that we have our favicons right over here. Perfect. Now to reference these images onto our HTML page, we have to link them the same way we do with the styles.css. But instead of typing in manually, what we can do is actually copy these two lines because they are going to reference the files we've just downloaded. And then on our index.html, let's go ahead and close this. And inside our head element, we can go ahead and copy these two new links. And as you can see, the link for our style.css, it's going to have a relationship of style sheet, while the other two is going to have a relationship of icon. And this is to tell the browser that these images that we are referencing here on the href attribute are going to be an icon to render on the tab of our web page. Now, of course, we have to also copy this and paste it in all of our pages. So let's go ahead and on our About page, copy here. Let me just pull this. The same for the projects page and the same for the services page, like so. So now, as you can see, we not only have the title of the page, but we also have the favicon from the images we've downloaded. If we change the pages, you can see that it's always going to stay with the same logo. Perfect. Congratulations on completing this course. I hope you enjoyed learning new skills and building together your very own portfolio website. And more importantly, I hope that as of now, you have the confidence needed to start writing HTML and CSS by your own and continue your web development journey. But before we end this, I would like to say some things to you. Firstly, this course is only the beginning. Simply by watching won't make you a developer. You have to put in the hard work and practice the skills you've just learned. And one effective way to do so is to actually try and replicate some websites or layouts you admire. Start with simple examples and then gradually try to tackle more complex interfaces such as YouTube or Reddit. Secondly, in web development and programming in general, learning never stops. HTML and CSS is only the tip of the iceberg. If you want to expand more of your knowledge on web development, consider trying to learn JavaScript, followed by exploring some libraries or frameworks like React or Solid.js for the front end, and for example, Node.js for the backend. You can also dive deeper and learn more advanced CSS or related technologies like Sass or Tailwind. And I understand this can be a little bit overwhelming, but remember that you don't have to learn everything at once. Take it slow, take it steady, and above all, have fun while doing so. As of now, this is my first course, but I have plans to start building new courses with the related technologies we've just discussed, so stay tuned. But to summarize everything, keep practicing, stay updated with web development news, never stop learning, and above all, have fun. It's been a pleasure having you here, and thank you for the opportunity of having me accompany you on your development journey. Until the next one, cheers.